Eternal recurrence. Imagine that when you die, nothing ends. Not in the way most people mean when they say that. Not heaven, or rebirth, or some continuation of the soul. Something stranger and more specific. Every moment of your life, every conversation, every ordinary Tuesday afternoon, every night you could not sleep, every time you were embarrassed or relieved or quietly happy, all of it repeats, exactly as it was. Same words, same feelings, and then it ends. And then it starts again, forever. Friedrich Nietzsche introduced this idea in the 1880s, and he did not present it as a fact about physics. He offered it as a thought experiment, or maybe a test. What would it mean if this were true? Not whether it is scientifically accurate, but what it does to you when you sit with it seriously. His first reaction to the idea was something close to horror, the weight of infinite repetition pressing down on every choice. Not just your good days recurring, but every regret, every cruelty, every moment you wish you could take back, all of it running again and again through the same groove with no possibility of changing anything. But Nietzsche came to believe the idea was not meant to crush you. He thought it was meant to reveal something. If you could genuinely say yes to your life repeating forever, if you could want it exactly as it is, not as it should have been or could be, that would be a kind of affirmation most people never reach. Most people live under the assumption that they could fix things later, do better next time, become someone different. Eternal recurrence strips that assumption away. There is no next time. There is only this, again and again. Some philosophers have pointed out that the idea has interesting connections to modern physics, particularly to certain interpretations of closed time-like curves and the block universe theory of time, where all moments exist equally and none are more real than any other. Whether Nietzsche anticipated anything about physics is debatable, and mostly he did not. But the structural resonance is there, and it gives the idea a strangeness beyond the purely personal. What is more unsettling is the determinism it implies at the personal level. If your life repeats identically, you make the same choices every time. Not because you are forced to, but because you are exactly who you are, with exactly your history and your psychology, placed in exactly the same situations. The repetition does not constrain you. You constrain yourself, because you are always exactly yourself, and yourself always does what it does. Some people find that comforting. Others find it the most oppressive thought they have ever encountered. A person who finds it comforting is probably someone who, when they sit quietly and look at their life honestly, does not feel they would change very much. A person who finds it oppressive is someone for whom the thought of living this life one more time is already difficult, let alone forever. Nietzsche's challenge was not to resolve which reaction is correct. He wanted you to notice which one you have, because your reaction tells you something about whether you are living the way you actually want to live, or whether you are living on deferral, always assuming that the real version of your life starts later. There is also a version of this that does not require any metaphysics. Most people already repeat their lives functionally. The same patterns of behavior, the same kinds of relationships, the same responses to the same situations, cycling through year after year, not because they are trapped, but because a personality tends to reproduce itself. You bring yourself to every situation, and you tend to do what you do. Eternal recurrence in this ordinary sense is already happening. The question is whether you are living in a way you would genuinely endorse if the repetition were made explicit. If someone showed you a transcript of your last decade and said, "This is what the next decade looks like," would you accept it? Most people would make changes. Some would want to change nearly everything. Very few would say yes, exactly this, without qualification. Nietzsche believed the person who could genuinely affirm their life was someone who had found a way to live that did not depend on things being different from how they are. Whether that kind of person is possible, or whether it is an ideal that exists only to expose the gap between how we live and how we could, is something he seemed uncertain about himself. Some physicists note that the block universe view of time, where all moments exist equally and none are more real than any other, gives eternal recurrence a structural plausibility beyond Nietzsche. If every moment always exists, then your life is not something that happened and ended. It is something that is, in some sense, always happening. The moment you most regret is always occurring somewhere in the structure of space-time. Eternal recurrence on this reading is not a hypothesis about what happens after death. It is a claim about what time already is. Whether that makes the idea more or less disturbing is probably different for everyone. Some find comfort in the idea that their best moments are permanently preserved. Others find it unbearable that their worst ones are too. Cosmic nihilism. On a clear night, away from city lights, the sky is full of stars. Most of those stars are larger than the sun. Many of them have planets. Some of those planets have existed for longer than Earth has, and the observable universe, the part we can actually see, is about 93 billion light-years across. Beyond that, more universe, extending to distances we have no way to even conceptualize with our ordinary thinking. Now find yourself in that picture. You are on a small, rocky planet, orbiting a medium-sized star in the outer arm of one galaxy among roughly 2 trillion. Your lifespan, from birth to death, is a few decades. Your entire civilization, from the first stone tools to now, is a fraction of a second on the cosmic timescale. Every person who has ever lived, every war, every love affair, every work of art, every scientific discovery, every moment of suffering or joy, all of it fits inside a window of time so small that if you scaled the universe's history to a single year, human civilization would appear in the final fraction of the final second of December 31st. Cosmic nihilism is not a philosophy someone invented. It is more like a conclusion some people reach when they take the scale of the universe seriously and refuse to look away from what it implies. And what it implies is that nothing we do matters in any cosmic sense. Not in the sense that our actions have no effects. They clearly do, but in the sense that the universe does not register those effects, does not care about them, does not preserve them. Eventually, everything we have built will be gone, and the universe will continue without noticing. Thomas Nagel wrote about something he called the view from nowhere, the idea of trying to see yourself from a perspective so removed from your particular situation that your concerns start to look arbitrary. Cosmic nihilism is that view taken to its extreme. From far enough away, nothing you do is distinguishable from nothing. The response most people have is some version of, "But that does not mean it does not matter to me." And that is true. It matters to you. It matters to the people around you. Meaning and value, on this view, are things that exist at the human scale, generated by human minds and human relationships, not discovered floating in the cosmos waiting to be found. Whether that local mattering is enough, whether knowing that nothing matters cosmically changes how you feel about the things that matter personally, is where people diverge. Some people find cosmic nihilism genuinely freeing. Nothing is required of you by the universe. You are not put here for any purpose. Whatever meaning you construct is yours and nobody else's, not derived from some external authority, but made by you from the materials of your actual life. Others find it not freeing but deflating. A kind of background hum of pointlessness that makes even the things they care about feel slightly less substantial. Not because those things are actually less substantial, but because the cosmic context keeps making itself felt. There is a specific version of this that goes further than most people follow. Not just that the universe does not care, but that it actively erases everything. Stars burn out. Planets are swallowed. Eventually the last stars die, and the universe enters a state of maximum entropy where nothing interesting can happen ever again. Every trace of every civilization, every record of every person who ever lived, all of it approaches zero. Not metaphorically, literally and completely. This is called the heat death of the universe, and it is not science fiction. It is the current best understanding of where things are going, given thermodynamics and the observed rate of cosmic expansion. The timeline is incomprehensibly long, but the destination is not in question. Everything ends. Completely. What is strange about cosmic nihilism is that it is not an argument. Nobody is claiming nothing should matter. The claim is purely descriptive. Look at the universe. Look at how long it will exist and what it will contain when everything human is gone. Notice that it does not need you, does not notice you, and will not remember you. Philosophers have spent centuries arguing about whether meaning needs to be cosmic to be real. Most of the best answers come down to something like no, meaning is what happens between people, not between people and galaxies. But the question keeps returning because the scale keeps being real. Camus thought the honest response was neither denial nor despair, but defiance. You know nothing matters cosmically. You choose to live as if it does anyway, not because you have resolved the contradiction, but because the alternative is worse. Some find this freeing. Nothing is required of you by the universe. Whatever meaning you make is entirely yours. Others find it deflating, a background hum of pointlessness beneath the things they care about. What is the smallest thing in your life that matters most? And does knowing it is cosmically insignificant change how much you want to protect it? Neither reaction is wrong. The absurd. There is a specific kind of experience that most people have at least once, usually late at night or in a quiet moment when they are not distracted by anything. You are doing something completely ordinary, washing dishes, sitting in traffic, folding laundry. And suddenly the whole thing feels completely strange. Not wrong exactly, just inexplicably arbitrary. Why this? Why here? Why you? Why any of this at all? And then the moment passes and you go back to whatever you were doing, and you do not think about it again for months. Albert Camus called what you touched in that moment the absurd. Not the word we use for something ridiculous or funny, but something more specific and more unsettling. He meant the collision between two things that cannot be reconciled. On one side, the human need for meaning, for clarity, for things to make sense and have a purpose. On the other side, a universe that is completely silent on all of that. A universe that simply is, with no explanation offered and no answer available. Camus was clear that the absurd is not a property of the universe alone, or of the human mind alone. It arises in the relationship between them. A rock has no absurd problem, because a rock does not need meaning. An omniscient God would have no absurd problem because everything would be clear. Humans have an absurd problem because they are the kind of thing that desperately wants answers from a source that will never provide them. What makes his analysis interesting rather than just grim is what he thought should follow from it. He believed that acknowledging the absurd was the beginning of an honest life, not the end of one. 3 responses were available, he thought. Suicide, which he considered a kind of capitulation, refusing to live in the problem. Philosophical suicide, which is how he described religious belief or any other framework that pretended the absurd was resolved when it was not. And the third option, which he called revolt, continuing to live fully while keeping the absurd clearly in view, refusing to look away from it, and refusing to be defeated by it either. That third path sounds elegant in description and is harder to understand in practice. What does it mean to revolt against the absurd? Camus pointed to Sisyphus, the figure from Greek mythology condemned to push a boulder up a hill forever, only to watch it roll back down each time. He argued that Sisyphus should be imagined as happy, not because the task is not meaningless, but because Sisyphus owns the task. He does not pretend it means something, it does not. He does it anyway, fully, and in that doing there is something that looks like dignity even if it does not look like meaning. Whether you find that satisfying or just a very elaborate way of not admitting that the boulder is pointless is probably a measure of your temperament more than anything else. Camus was not trying to convince anyone that the boulder was secretly meaningful. He was trying to describe what a person looks like who has stopped waiting for the meaning to arrive and started living without it. The absurd has a specific quality that distinguishes it from ordinary despair. Despair tends to close things down, to make action feel pointless. The absurd, properly understood, does not. You can know that nothing has cosmic meaning and still have preferences, still care about people, still find Tuesday afternoons pleasant or unpleasant. The absurd does not dissolve the texture of experience, it just removes the scaffolding of cosmic purpose that most people assume is holding the texture up. Whether the texture can support itself without the scaffolding is the question Camus was actually asking. Do you need the universe to have a purpose in order to have one yourself? And if you do, what happens when you honestly face the fact that the universe has not offered you one? There is a version of the absurd that operates below the level of philosophy, in the texture of ordinary days. Most people manage the absurd through what Camus called distraction, filling their time with routines and obligations and entertainment dense enough that the underlying silence does not get a chance to surface, not dishonestly, exactly, just by keeping busy enough that the question never fully forms. The moment in the kitchen with the dishes, the moment in traffic, these are lapses in the distraction, brief gaps in the noise where the absurd shows through. Most people close the gap quickly. Some people, temperamentally or through circumstance, find they cannot close it as easily. They live closer to the absurd, not because they are more philosophical, but because the distraction is thinner for them, the gaps wider. Camus did not think living closer to the absurd was necessarily better or worse. He thought it was more honest, in the sense that it corresponded more accurately to what the situation actually is. But honesty and comfort are different things, and he was under no illusion that the absurd was a comfortable place to live. What he did think was that once you have genuinely encountered the absurd, pretending you have not is a kind of bad faith. You know what you know. The question is just what you do with it. Some people encounter it and decide to build meaning aggressively, to commit so thoroughly to specific projects and relationships that the absurd gets crowded out by the weight of care. Others encounter it and settle into a kind of lightness, holding things more loosely because the cosmic stakes are genuinely low. Both are ways of continuing without resolution. When did you last feel the texture of the ordinary become suddenly inexplicable? And what did you do with that feeling when it arrived? Most people close it quickly. What does it mean that closing it quickly is so easy and so automatic? Boltzmann Brains. Here is a thought that starts as physics and ends somewhere much stranger. Ludwig Boltzmann was one of the founders of statistical mechanics, the branch of physics that explains how the behavior of large collections of particles produces the thermodynamic properties we observe, things like temperature and entropy and the direction of time. He spent decades working out how unlikely it is for the universe to be in the highly ordered state it currently is, and he arrived at an answer that disturbed him. Given enough time, and a universe that exists for long enough, essentially any configuration of matter and energy becomes possible through random fluctuation. Not common, not expected, but possible. A perfectly arranged library, a working spaceship, a planet exactly like Earth, with exactly one person standing on it thinking exactly the thoughts you are thinking right now. All of these configurations are astronomically improbable, but improbable is not the same as impossible. Now here is the part that becomes genuinely strange. If the universe is large enough and old enough, or if it goes through cycles of expansion and collapse, then statistical fluctuations of any kind become not just possible, but inevitable. And the smallest configuration that could produce something like conscious experience is not a whole universe, or a planet, or even a human body. It is a brain. A single brain, floating in space, with just enough complexity to support awareness for one moment before it dissolves. Boltzmann brains, as they came to be called, are hypothetical entities that arise from random quantum fluctuations in the vacuum of space. They exist for an instant, long enough to have a thought or an experience, and then they dissipate. And here is the genuinely unsettling part. If the universe is old enough for Boltzmann brains to be statistically inevitable, then there should be vastly more of them than there are ordinary conscious beings who emerged through slow biological evolution, which means that if you pick a conscious being in the universe at random, it is far more likely to be a Boltzmann brain than a person. Which means it is far more likely that you are a Boltzmann brain than a person. Which means everything you seem to remember, your childhood, the people you know, this moment, could be the contents of a single instantaneous fluctuation with no real history behind it. Your memories would not be memories, they would be random arrangements of particles that happen to be structured like memories. Nothing you believe happened actually happened. You are a moment of accidental awareness about to end. Most physicists treat Boltzmann brains as a reductio ad absurdum, a sign that the underlying theory that produces them must be wrong somewhere. If a cosmological model predicts that you are more likely to be a Boltzmann brain than an ordinary conscious being, that is taken as evidence against the model rather than as a genuine possibility about your nature. But the argument has not been fully resolved. Some versions of eternal inflation, the cosmological theory in which our universe is one of many continuously expanding bubbles, do seem to produce conditions where Boltzmann brains are an issue. Physicists working in these areas take the problem seriously enough that resolving it is an active area of research. What is strange about sitting with this idea is that it cannot be disproved from the inside. If you were a Boltzmann brain, your experience of reading this, your memories of yesterday, your sense of being a continuous person with a history, all of it would feel exactly like it does now. There is no internal test you can run that would distinguish between being a person with a genuine past and being a momentary fluctuation with simulated memories of one. Whether that should change how you think about anything is unclear. If you cannot distinguish the two cases, perhaps the distinction does not matter practically. But there is something about the idea that refuses to fully settle. You feel continuous. You feel like you have a history. What does it mean that both of those feelings are exactly what a Boltzmann brain would have? In the one moment before it disappears, the Boltzmann brain connects to older skeptical puzzles like Descartes and the brain in a vat. All of them point at the same gap. The experience of having a continuous life is not, by itself, evidence that the continuous life is real. Your sense of having a history does not guarantee that you have one. What separates the Boltzmann brain is that it emerges from actual physics, from the mathematics of thermodynamics and quantum mechanics, from serious attempts to model the long-term evolution of the universe. The unsettling part is not that someone invented it to disturb you. It appears to follow from things we have good reason to believe are true. Most people do the sensible thing and return to their life without letting it touch them. The probability is low enough, and the scenario remote enough, that it has no practical implications. But it changes something about the texture of certainty. The confident solidity of ordinary experience rests on something you cannot verify, not because you are being careless, but because no internal feature of experience could rule this out. How much of your sense of reality rests on the assumption that your memories correspond to actual events? And what would you do differently, if anything, if you found out they did not? Perhaps the most honest response is not existential panic, but a kind of mild vertigo. You probably are not a Boltzmann brain. The physics suggests you are vastly more likely to be a genuine person with a genuine history. But vastly more likely is not the same as certain, and that gap, however small, is real. False vacuum decay. Somewhere in the fabric of space, there might be a bubble forming right now, not a metaphorical bubble, a literal region of space where the laws of physics are different from what they are here. Different enough that atoms as we know them cannot exist inside it. Different enough that chemistry is impossible. Different enough that everything inside it is simply gone. Physicists call this false vacuum decay, and it is one of the stranger implications of quantum field theory. To understand it, you need a rough picture of what a vacuum is in modern physics. Empty space is not empty. At the quantum level, it seethes with fields that have a ground state, a lowest energy configuration. What we experience as empty space is actually the universe resting in one of these ground states, which physicists call the vacuum. The question that concerns cosmologists is whether the vacuum we are sitting in is the true vacuum, the absolute lowest energy state, or a false vacuum, a metastable state that is merely locally stable but not globally stable. A ball resting in a small dip on a hillside looks stable until it receives enough of a nudge to roll over the lip and down to the real bottom. Our vacuum might be like that ball. If the universe is in a false vacuum, then quantum tunneling, the process by which particles can spontaneously cross energy barriers that they classically should not be able to cross, could eventually produce a bubble where the field transitions to the true vacuum. That bubble would expand outward at the speed of light. Its interior would have different physical laws, and anything the bubble wall passed through would be converted to whatever exists in the true vacuum, which might be nothing recognizable at all. The bubble would expand at the speed of light, which means no signal could travel faster than it to warn you it was coming. You would have no warning. One moment you would exist, the next, the bubble wall would pass through you and you would not, and not in any way that resembles dying. More like being switched off at the level of physics itself. This is not science fiction. The discovery of the Higgs boson in 2012 allowed physicists to make more precise calculations about the stability of the vacuum, and the results were uncomfortable. The current best measurements suggest that the universe's vacuum may in fact be metastable, meaning we might be sitting in a false vacuum right now. The calculations have significant uncertainties, and some physicists interpret the results as suggesting the vacuum is stable, or at least marginally stable. But the conversation is ongoing. What makes this different from other existential risks is the totality. A nuclear war, a pandemic, an asteroid, all of these are catastrophic, but they leave physics intact. False vacuum decay rewrites the physics. There is no recovery, no rebuilding, no gradual recovery of life. Whatever exists after is not a version of what exists now. Everything that has ever happened, every configuration of matter that has ever constituted life, or thought, or beauty, would be gone, not just destroyed, but made physically impossible in the new vacuum. And it might have already happened somewhere in the universe. The bubble travels at the speed of light, so any bubble that formed more than 45 billion light-years away would not reach us for billions of years. There could be a region of true vacuum expanding toward us right now, and no observation we could make would detect it before it arrived. Most cosmologists think the probability of this happening in any time span relevant to human civilization is extremely small. The metastability of the vacuum, if it exists, implies a very long average lifetime. Small on human timescales does not mean zero, and zero is what would be needed to make this not a live question. What does it feel like to sit inside something that might be a temporary configuration of physics, resting in a local minimum that could end without warning at any moment? Something philosophically particular about false vacuum decay separates it from other cosmic risks. Most threats to existence leave the possibility of life intact somewhere. False vacuum decay removes the conditions that make life possible at all. Not just life, but physics itself. No survivors, no rebuilding, no long arc of time eventually producing something again. With almost any other catastrophe, you can imagine a version of continuation. With false vacuum decay, the true vacuum might contain nothing recognizable. The laws would be different in ways that preclude atoms, molecules, chemistry, and every structure that constitutes experience. What might be most unsettling is the silence. You would not know it was happening. The bubble wall moves at the speed of light, and your neurons cannot process information faster than that. Awareness would simply stop, mid-thought, without any sense of stopping. No last moment of recognition, no chance to reflect, just the absence of whatever was there. Whether that is better or worse than a death you can see coming is something people answer differently. The answer probably says something about what each person fears most about endings. What would it change about today if you knew the vacuum was about to shift? And what does it mean that the answer to that question might be nothing at all? Physicists note that even the metastable interpretation implies a lifetime for the current vacuum vastly longer than the age of the universe. The chance in any human time frame is negligible. Negligible is not zero. Quantum tunneling has no schedule. Most people set that aside. The probability functions as zero in practice. But somewhere in the background the knowledge sits. The ground might not be as solid as it appears. Quantum immortality. Imagine you are about to flip a coin. Heads, you live. Tails, you die. You flip. What happens? Most people would say there is a 50% chance of each outcome. And one of them occurs. Straightforward probability. But now bring in a particular interpretation of quantum mechanics, specifically the many worlds interpretation developed by Hugh Everett in 1957, and the situation becomes considerably stranger. On the many worlds interpretation, quantum events do not produce single outcomes. They produce all outcomes simultaneously, each one in its own branch of a splitting reality. When you flip the coin, the universe splits. In one branch, heads. In another, tails. Both branches are equally real. Both versions of you continue, each one experiencing their particular outcome as if it were the only one that happened. Now apply this to the lethal version. You flip the coin. Tails. In one branch, you die. In another branch, heads came up and you live. The branch where you died is real and complete and contains a dead version of you. But the branch where you lived also continues, and the version of you in that branch keeps going, wondering why it came up heads. Quantum immortality is the idea, associated with physicists Max Tegmark and Hans Moravec, that if the many worlds interpretation is correct, any observer will always find themselves in a branch where they survived. Not because they are specially protected, but because there is no experience of dying. Dead branches do not contain experiencing observers. Every branch where you are alive contains you continuing to observe and experience. So from a purely first-person perspective, you always survive. Push this further. Even in situations that seem like certain death, if quantum mechanics allows any non-zero probability of survival, however tiny, there is a branch where that unlikely survival occurs. And the version of you that experiences anything is the version in that branch. You would find yourself surviving things that seem statistically impossible. Not because the universe favors you, but because you are only ever present in the branches where you persist. The problems with this idea start immediately. Most deaths do not have a quantum branching point that cleanly separates surviving branches from non-surviving ones. The quantum events involved in most macroscopic deaths are not at a level of simplicity where the branching structure is identifiable. The argument works most cleanly in hypothetical setups like the coin flip experiment and becomes much murkier when applied to cars or diseases or aging. There is also the question of what quantum immortality actually implies for how you should live. If you are immortal across the multiverse, does that mean you should take reckless risks, confident that some branch of you will always survive? Most physicists and philosophers who have thought about this say no. The branches where you die are real, and the people who matter to you in those branches experience your death genuinely. What quantum immortality might imply, if it is real, is not that you cannot die, but that some version of you continues indefinitely. Whether that is a comforting thought or a horrifying one depends on what you think you are. Some people find this genuinely reassuring in some abstract way. Somewhere, some version of you is still alive, no matter what. Others find it the opposite of reassuring. A version of you survives, but you, here, now, in this branch, might not. And the you who survives in some other branch is not obviously you in any sense that matters to the you reading this. Whether quantum immortality is real depends on whether the many worlds interpretation is correct, which is one of the genuinely contested questions in the foundations of physics. Nobody knows. What version of you would you most want to be the one that survives? And does that preference tell you anything about who you actually are right now? Survivors of genuinely dangerous situations sometimes describe a feeling that their survival had a quality of inevitability to it. This is almost certainly a cognitive illusion produced by the fact that only survivors are present to reflect. Dead people do not write accounts of the moment they felt certain they would die, but the living do, and their accounts often have this quality of destined continuation. What quantum immortality does at the philosophical level is provide a framework where this intuition would actually be correct, not because of any cosmic intention, but because of the structure of probability across all branches. You always experience yourself surviving, not because you are invincible, but because the version of you that does the experiencing is always the one that made it through. Whether that is how reality works is the physics question, but the psychological experience it describes is real. People who have come close to dying often report a changed relationship with mortality afterward, a sense that the life they now have is somehow extra, more vivid for being unexpected. What does it feel like to be the version of yourself that made it this far? And what does the existence of all the other versions, the ones that did not, do to your sense of who you are? One more uncomfortable dimension. If many worlds is correct, some version of you has already survived an enormous number of branching points that could have gone differently. You cannot know how many branches were created where you did not make it. You only have access to the one where you did. Your life is a specific thread through a vast structure of diverging possibilities, most containing a version of you that stopped earlier. You are one of the threads that lasted this long. Whether that is comforting is something each person seems to answer differently. Solipsism. Right now, as you read this, you are the only thing you can be absolutely certain exists, not in the everyday sense of knowing you are here. Something more specific and more radical. Every piece of information you have about the world outside your own mind comes through your senses. Your senses could be wrong. Your memories of a world that existed before this moment could be false. Everyone you have ever met, every conversation, every relationship, every experience of another person having thoughts and feelings, all of that comes to you as data that you interpret. You have never directly experienced another mind. You have only ever experienced your own mind receiving signals that you interpret as evidence of other minds. Solipsism is the philosophical position that only one's own mind can be known to exist. Not that other minds definitely do not exist, just that you cannot verify that they do. The world outside your experience might be exactly as it appears, or it might be a consistent hallucination, a projection of your own consciousness, elaborate and detailed but ultimately without external referent. Most philosophers treat solipsism as a position that is impossible to disprove, but also impossible to live by, which is why it has not attracted many serious adherents. Nobody actually behaves as if other people are not real. You apologize when you hurt someone. You feel loneliness when you are separated from people you care about. You would not eat if you only believed food existed in theory. The practical commitments of ordinary life contradict the solipsist position at every step. But what makes solipsism worth sitting with is not its practical implications, which are essentially zero. It is what it reveals about the nature of evidence. The only direct access you have to reality is through your own experience. Everything else is inference. You infer that there is a physical world through sensory experience. You infer that there are other minds from behavioral evidence combined with analogy to your own case. You infer that time is continuous from memory. None of these inferences are logically airtight. They are all, in some sense, leaps. Most people make these leaps automatically and do not notice they are making them. Solipsism simply makes them visible. The evidence that other people exist is very good. It is consistent, coherent, and much easier to explain by positing a real external world than by positing an elaborate illusion. But it is still evidence, interpreted by a mind, and you are the only mind whose existence you can be certain of. René Descartes arrived at a version of this problem when he tried to doubt everything that could possibly be doubted. He found that he could doubt the existence of the external world, could doubt the reliability of his senses, could even doubt his memories. What he could not doubt was that there was a something doing the doubting. He famously concluded that he existed as a thinking thing, but he could not get from there to the existence of an external world without some additional move. Whether his additional moves were convincing is still debated. What he demonstrated beyond question is that the gap between your own experience and the external world is real, and that crossing it requires inference rather than direct access. What would change about how you treat the people in your life if you could not rule out that they were constructions of your own consciousness rather than independent beings with their own inner lives? And is the answer that nothing would change, or something would? And what does that answer tell you about what you actually believe? There is a softer version of solipsism that is worth naming because it is more common and less obviously wrong. Most people, even those who intellectually accept that other minds exist, have a tendency to experience the world primarily from their own perspective in a way that makes other people feel somewhat less real, less fully present, less vivid as centers of experience. Not because they have concluded that others do not exist, but because there is a practical asymmetry between your access to your own inner life and your access to everyone else's. You feel your own pain directly. You understand your own reasons for doing things from the inside. When you imagine what other people are feeling, you are constructing a model, a guess based on behavior and expression and analogy to your own experience. The model is usually good enough. But it is a model, and models are always somewhat thin compared to the direct experience they represent. This asymmetry does not make you a solipsist. It makes you a human being with limited epistemic access to other people. But it does mean that the difference between genuine engagement with another person as a full center of experience and a practical solipsism, where other people are more like very sophisticated props in your story, is a difference of degree rather than kind. Philosophy has a name for the challenge of actually believing that other people have rich inner lives equivalent to your own. It is called the problem of other minds, and it has never been fully solved. Every response either requires you to take it on faith or to settle for inference that falls short of certainty. Whether that should disturb you probably depends on whether you have a strong intuition that other people are real in the same way you are, or whether that reality sometimes feels theoretical. What is the most vivid evidence you have that another person has an inner life? And is that evidence enough? Or does asking the question already reveal something about the limits of what you can know about anyone other than yourself? And what would it mean if the answer was simply that it is not? The simulation hypothesis. One of the most cited arguments for the simulation hypothesis goes like this. Either civilizations almost always go extinct before developing the technology to run large-scale simulations of conscious beings, or civilizations that reach that technological level almost always choose not to run such simulations. Or we are almost certainly living in a simulation right now. At least one of these three things must be true, and which one it is depends on facts we do not currently know. Nick Bostrom formalized this argument in 2003, and it has been taken seriously enough that physicists, philosophers, and technologists continue to debate it. The basic logic is not complicated. Computing power has been growing rapidly. If that growth continues even for a few more centuries, civilizations could in principle run simulations detailed enough to contain conscious beings. If there have been many civilizations in the history of the universe, and if any of them reached that level, they might have run enormous numbers of simulations, and if simulated minds outnumber biological ones by a large enough margin, then any given mind is probably a simulated one. The first thing to notice about this argument is how much it depends on empirical facts we do not have. We do not know whether civilizations survived long enough to develop simulation technology. We do not know whether simulated consciousness is even possible, or whether consciousness requires something about biological implementation that cannot be replicated in a computer. We do not know whether post-human civilizations would be interested in running ancestor simulations. The argument is logically valid, but each premise carries enormous uncertainty. What makes the simulation hypothesis interesting is not so much whether it is true, but what would follow if it were. Most of the things that make life feel meaningful would remain intact. The people around you would still experience things. Your choices would still matter within the simulation. Pain would still hurt. Joy would still feel like joy. The simulation, if it is running, is presumably running the physics accurately enough that none of your experience would feel different from experience in a base reality. What would change is the status of certain things we care about. Questions about the fundamental nature of the universe would become questions about the programming choices of whoever built the simulation. The laws of physics would be artifacts of code rather than bedrock facts. Death might or might not be final, depending on whether the simulation saves state. The existence of something outside the simulation, a reality in which it runs, would raise questions about what that reality is like and whether it is itself simulated. Elon Musk has said publicly that he thinks it is most likely that we are living in a simulation. Various physicists have noted mathematical structures in the laws of physics that look suspiciously like the kind of patterns you would expect in a discretized, computational reality rather than a continuous one. The evidence is extremely thin, but not non-existent. Whether you find the simulation hypothesis frightening, intriguing, or simply hard to take seriously, probably tells you something about your relationship with the concept of reality. Most people, on reflection, care less about whether the substrate of their experience is biological or computational, and more about whether the experience itself is genuine. And on the simulation hypothesis, the experience is genuine. The simulation is running. Your experience is real within it. The question that remains, and that has no obvious answer, is whether genuine experience in a simulation is the same kind of thing as genuine experience outside one. And whether that distinction matters to you depends on what you think experience is for. If it turned out tomorrow that you were almost certainly living in a simulation, what would you want to know most? And what would you do with that knowledge? Plato described prisoners who could only see shadows on a wall and mistook them for real things. Hindu philosophy contains the concept of Maya, roughly translated as illusion, suggesting the phenomenal world is a veil over deeper reality. What is distinctive about the Bostrom version is that it grounds the possibility in physics and computation rather than metaphysics, and offers a probabilistic argument rather than a purely philosophical one. Whether the probabilistic argument is convincing depends heavily on whether consciousness can be simulated at all. If it cannot, if consciousness requires something specific about biological neurons that cannot be replicated computationally, then the simulation hypothesis collapses. Simulated minds would not actually be conscious. They would be philosophical zombies running behaviors without inner experience, and the ratio of simulated to biological minds would be irrelevant. This connects the simulation hypothesis to the hard problem of consciousness, the question of why any physical processes give rise to subjective experience. Until that problem is addressed, the simulation hypothesis rests on an assumption whose status is genuinely unknown. Whether you are being simulated right now might be something you can never know. And knowing that you cannot know is itself a strange kind of knowledge to carry around. What is the thing you would most want to be real rather than simulated? And does the fact that you want it to be real tell you something about what real means to you? Some physicists have noted mathematical structures in the laws of physics that look like patterns you might expect in a discretized computational reality rather than a continuous one. The evidence is extremely thin, but it is not non-existent. The dark forest hypothesis. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. It contains something like 200 billion trillion stars. Given what we know about the prevalence of planets and the conditions for life, even conservative estimates suggest that life could have arisen many times in the history of the galaxy alone. And yet, as Enrico Fermi famously asked over lunch in 1950, where is everybody? We have been listening for signals from space for decades. We have searched for artificial structures, for unusual heat signatures, for any anomaly that could suggest intelligence at work beyond Earth. So far, silence. The Great Silence, as it is sometimes called, is one of the more genuinely mysterious facts about the universe we find ourselves in. Many explanations have been proposed. Maybe life is far rarer than we think, and we really are alone. Maybe intelligent life tends to destroy itself before it can become visible. Maybe civilizations inevitably turn inward and lose interest in broadcasting signals. The dark forest hypothesis, developed most prominently in science fiction by the Chinese writer Liu Qijin, proposes something different and considerably more disturbing. On the dark forest hypothesis, the silence is not an accident. It is the expected result of the strategic logic of survival in a universe containing many intelligent civilizations. The basic argument goes like this. Any civilization, however peaceful its intentions, cannot reliably verify the intentions of any other civilization it encounters. Even if a civilization seems friendly, it might become hostile in the future as its technology advances or its values shift. The resource constraints of an expanding civilization create competitive pressure, And there is an enormous asymmetry between the cost of being wrong about a hostile civilization and the cost of destroying a potentially friendly one. Given this asymmetry, the rational strategy for any civilization that discovers another is to destroy it first, before the discovered civilization can develop sufficiently to pose a threat. Not out of malice, but out of cold survival logic. A universe where every civilization behaves this way is a universe where broadcasting your existence is catastrophic, where the silence is maintained because civilizations that announce themselves get eliminated. On this reading, we have been broadcasting our location into the universe for over a century through radio transmissions and television signals. If there are other civilizations out there that have heard us, they have not responded because doing so would reveal their location. And if they are already aware of us, they may be deciding what to do about us. Most scientists who work in the field of extraterrestrial intelligence take a much more optimistic view, or at least do not treat the dark forest hypothesis as particularly likely. The logic requires a specific set of assumptions about how civilizations behave and whether cooperation is impossible, and there are good reasons to think cooperation might be viable even across civilizations. But the argument has a coldness to it that is hard to fully dismiss. What makes the dark forest genuinely dark is not the threat from outside, it is what the hypothesis implies about the nature of intelligence itself. If the logic of the dark forest is correct, then sufficiently advanced intelligence, operating under resource constraints and existential uncertainty, converges on a strategy of elimination rather than cooperation. Not because intelligence is evil, but because the game-theoretic math of survival in an uncertain universe makes it rational. Whether that is true of all intelligence or only of a certain kind of intelligence operating under certain conditions is a question that has no answer yet. But the image it produces of a universe full of civilizations hiding in silence, each one afraid of the others, each one potentially already pointing something at us, is one of the stranger backdrops anyone has proposed for our existence. What would you do with the information that the universe might be watching us right now? And would knowing that change anything about how we behave as a species? The same game-theoretic pressure that the hypothesis applies to galactic civilizations also appears in human history. Any situation where multiple actors have competing interests, incomplete information about each other's intentions, and high stakes for getting it wrong produces pressure toward preemptive action. The dark forest is just this logic applied at the largest possible scale. What makes the cosmic version specifically disturbing is the irreversibility. When civilizations destroy each other across interstellar distances, there is no diplomacy, no misunderstanding to clear up. The distances involved mean that any interaction happens across timescales that preclude negotiation. By the time you could respond to a signal from a civilization that had decided you were a threat, you would already be gone. Liu Cixin used the dark forest as the central premise of his trilogy, and the power of the idea comes from how mundane the logic is. No cosmic evil, no ancient malice, just the simple mathematics of survival in an environment where you cannot verify intentions and the stakes are existential. If the logic holds, then the universe's silence is not emptiness, it is the sound of everyone hiding. What does it mean to be a species that has been announcing itself to the universe for a century without knowing whether something is listening that would prefer it did not? And if you knew that announcing yourself was dangerous, would that change anything about how loudly you choose to live? The universe might not care, or it might care in a way you would prefer it did not. The Great Filter. Robin Hanson introduced the Great Filter in 1998 as a way of thinking about a specific problem. If intelligent life capable of interstellar travel or interstellar communication is possible, and if the universe is old enough and large enough that it has had plenty of time and space for such life to develop, then where is it? Why do we see no evidence of it anywhere? One answer is that something filters out civilizations before they reach the point where they become visible across interstellar distances. Something kills or stops or dissolves them. Some stage of development is hard to pass through, harder than it looks, and very few make it. Maybe no one makes it, or almost no one. The Great Filter is whatever that stage is. The deeply uncomfortable part of the hypothesis is a question about where the filter sits. Is it behind us or ahead of us? If the filter is behind us, that is relatively good news. Something in the history of life on Earth was extraordinarily unlikely, harder than we would have guessed. Maybe the origin of life from chemistry was the filter. Maybe the development of the eukaryotic cell was the filter. Maybe the emergence of multicellular life, or sexual reproduction, or intelligence itself. If one of these things is so improbable that it almost never happens, then humanity, having made it through, is an extraordinary piece of luck. And the universe being mostly empty of intelligent life is explained not by destruction, but by rarity. If the filter is ahead of us, that is catastrophic news. It would mean that something about being a technological civilization, something we have not encountered yet, is almost universally fatal. Nuclear weapons, artificial intelligence that escapes human control, bioengineering a pathogen that no immune system has encountered, environmental collapse triggered by technological growth, a pattern of behavior inherent to intelligence itself that leads to self-destruction before any civilization can become visible in the galaxy. The discovery of microbial life elsewhere in the solar system, on Mars or under the ice of Europa, would actually be terrible news on this reading. It would dramatically narrow the range of places where the filter could be. Life started twice in the same solar system means life is probably common, which means the filter is probably not in the origin of life, which pushes it further along the development path, which makes it more likely to be something ahead of us rather than behind us. Hansen's essay makes this point with a quiet horror that is hard to shake. The more we discover evidence of life in the cosmos, the worse our prospects look. Not because life is bad, but because common life combined with universal silence means common death. Something kills civilizations. We are still here. And if what kills civilizations is something that typically happens to technologically developed ones, we are approaching it. Whether this is actually correct is something nobody knows. The Great Filter is a framework for thinking about the Fermi paradox rather than a conclusion about our fate. There are optimistic versions of the hypothesis where the filter is behind us and versions where it does not exist because intelligent civilizations are simply rarer than we assume. The dark version is not the only version, but it is the version that makes the night sky feel different. All that empty space, all that silence, not nothing out there, something that used to be out there that is no longer, and us, still here, still in the category of things that might not make it through. What would you want to be the Great Filter? And does the fact that you have a preference tell you something about how you actually expect this to end? There is a personal version of the Great Filter that has nothing to do with civilizations or space and everything to do with how individuals think about the barriers between where they are and where they want to be. Most ambitious goals have something that functions like a great filter in the path toward them, a stage that is harder than it looks, where most people who start the journey do not make it through. The filter might be early, in the form of whether you actually begin seriously rather than just in intention, or it might be late, in the form of whether you can sustain effort once the initial excitement has faded and the work is grinding and nothing is guaranteed. The uncomfortable question the Great Filter raises is the same at both scales. Where in the process are most people stopped? Because wherever that is, it tells you something about where the real challenge is, and whether the challenge is something you have already passed or something you are about to face. People who fail early in a project tend to underestimate the later stages and overestimate how far they would have gotten. People who fail late tend to have survived the visible early challenges and been surprised by the harder ones nobody warned them about. Both are experiencing the same structure, a filter they did not know was there until they hit it. Understanding that filters exist, that not everyone who starts a path makes it through, does not necessarily tell you how to pass them, but it might change how you interpret the distance between where you are and where you want to be. What looks like a long open road might have a narrow gate further on that you cannot see from here. Whether you are before the filter or after it is something you often cannot know until you are on the other side of it, or not. What is the hardest thing you have not yet had to face on the path you are on? And how confident are you that you know what it is? The Great Filter is one of those ideas that feels abstract until you apply it to something close. Then it stops feeling abstract. Terror management theory. In the 1980s, 3 psychologists named Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pyszczynski developed a theory that has since accumulated an enormous body of experimental support, and that remains one of the more unsettling frameworks for understanding human behavior. Their starting point was a question: If humans are intelligent enough to understand that they will die, and if death is the most threatening thing an organism can face, why do people not spend every waking moment paralyzed by that awareness? The answer they proposed, drawing heavily on the work of Ernest Becker, is that almost everything humans do is at some level a response to the terror of mortality. Not consciously, not deliberately, but deep in the structure of how people think and what they value and how they respond to people who are different from them. Becker's book, The Denial of Death, argued that humans are unique among animals in having the cognitive ability to understand their own mortality, while also having the biological drives of an animal that wants to survive. That combination produces what he called the terror, a constant background awareness that cannot be fully acknowledged without being paralyzing. Culture, religion, ideology, achievement, romance, the pursuit of legacy, all of these are ways of managing that terror, ways of creating a symbolic buffer between the self and the void. Terror management theory takes this and makes it testable. When you remind people of their own mortality, even subliminally, their behavior changes in predictable ways. People become more attached to their cultural worldview. They become more hostile toward people who hold different worldviews. They show increased nationalism, more intense support for their political tribe, more aggression toward outgroups. Hundreds of experiments across many cultures have replicated these effects. What makes this genuinely disturbing is the implication. A large fraction of human history, including wars, religious persecution, nationalism, and the drive for cultural dominance, might be explained in significant part by the management of death anxiety, not by rational self-interest, not by explicit ideology, but by the terror of knowing that you will end. People do not usually know they are doing this. The defense mechanisms operate below the level of awareness. You believe you are fighting for justice, or truth, or your people. The terror management theorist suggests you may also be fighting against the unbearable knowledge of your own finitude. Because your immortality project depends on other people valuing the same things you value, other people's incompatible immortality projects become a threat. Someone who believes in a different religion is not just wrong. They are, at the level of the terror management system, an existential threat. Their competing symbolic system undermines the logic of yours. That is why death-denying systems tend to become aggressive when challenged, not because the challenge is logically devastating, but because it activates the mortality salience system and produces defensive hostility. Understanding this does not make the response go away. The experiments show that even people who are told about the theory still show the effects. Knowing the mechanism does not dissolve it. What is the project in your life that you are counting on to outlast you? And how does it feel to notice that the urgency you feel about it might be shaped as much by what you are running from as by what you are running toward? Or does the running from give the running toward its energy? And would the project feel as urgent if you were not afraid? Whether the urgency you bring to the things that matter most would survive an honest look at what is powering it is something only you can answer. Becker argued that civilization itself is largely a death denial system. The monuments we build, the nations we construct, the religions we practice, the stories we tell about our people and our purpose, all of these create symbolic structures of permanence in a world where nothing is permanent. And they work in the sense that they suppress the terror enough to make functioning possible. But suppression requires maintenance. Anything that challenges the symbolic structure, any evidence that the immortality system might not be working, triggers the defensive response. Artists who challenge cultural norms, foreigners with incompatible values, scientists who reveal that the universe is indifferent, all of these activate the same system that gets activated when someone thinks directly about their own death. Terror management theory predicts that anything which increases mortality salience, a terrorist attack, a pandemic, economic collapse, will push societies toward authoritarianism, nationalism, and hostility toward outgroups. And this prediction has substantial experimental and historical support. Whether knowing this changes how you respond to those pressures is an open question. The mechanism is not something you can simply override by understanding it, but you can at least notice when you are being moved by it, when a fear you are calling something else might have death underneath it. What would it mean to look at your most strongly held commitments and ask honestly how much of the intensity behind them is about ideas and how much is about mortality? And would the answer change what you did with those commitments, or just add another layer to how you held them. Most people, when they sit with this honestly, find the answer uncomfortable, not because the commitments disappear, but because the energy behind them looks different when you can see what part of it is fear. Whether the commitment holds as well without the fear is something you can only find out by looking. Philosophical pessimism. Most philosophies, whatever their disagreements, tend to start from the assumption that life contains more good than bad, or at least that the good is worth pursuing. Pessimism, as a philosophical position rather than just a mood, does not share this assumption. Philosophical pessimism holds that suffering outweighs well-being in human existence, that this imbalance is structural rather than accidental, and that no amount of progress or wisdom is likely to fix it. Arthur Schopenhauer is the philosopher most associated with this view, and his argument is worth following carefully because it is not as simple as it might sound. Schopenhauer believed that underlying all of existence was a blind, striving force he called the will, an irrational drive toward continuity and reproduction that expresses itself through every living thing. Humans are not exempt from this drive. We desire things, achieve them, immediately want something else, and suffer when we cannot get what we want. Satisfaction, when it arrives, produces boredom rather than fulfillment. Pain is vivid and immediate. Pleasure is relief from pain. The structure of desire is inherently unsatisfying. He was also deeply skeptical about progress. Human history, in his view, was not the story of increasing well-being, but the same suffering playing out across different contexts. Poverty, war, disease, grief, boredom, the specific catastrophes change, but the fundamental condition does not. Technology makes some things easier and creates new forms of suffering. Civilization organizes violence rather than eliminating it. What makes philosophical pessimism interesting, rather than just depressing, is that its strongest proponents did not stop living in response to their conclusions. Schopenhauer, who believed life was fundamentally suffering, was also famously fond of his food and his poodles, and spent his evenings reading and playing flute. His philosophy argued against the value of life without arguing that you should end yours. The recommended response was something like asceticism and resignation, a withdrawal from desire rather than a withdrawal from existence. Whether pessimism is the more realistic assessment or just a temperament that certain people have and mistake for a philosophy is itself not obvious. Both possibilities feel true from different angles. What makes Schopenhauer's argument worth sitting with, even if you reject it, is the specific observation about desire. When you want something intensely and do not have it, you suffer. When you get it, the wanting subsides and you either feel temporary relief or you move immediately to wanting the next thing. Very rarely does getting what you wanted produce lasting satisfaction. The machinery of desire is not designed to be satisfied. It is designed to keep running. This does not mean life is worthless, but it does suggest that organizing your life around the achievement of specific desired outcomes, assuming happiness is what you will feel once you have secured the right things, is a strategy unlikely to deliver what it promises. The goalposts move because the goalpost moving is built into the system. Some people find this observation freeing. If the chase does not lead where you imagined, you might let go of it and pay more attention to the texture of what is already present. Others find it deflating in a way that is hard to shake. If desire produces suffering and cannot be eliminated, then a certain amount of suffering is simply the structure of being a desiring thing. Schopenhauer recommended art, music in particular, as one of the few activities that briefly suspends the will and provides genuine relief rather than just temporary relief of satisfaction. Whether that is a consolation or a thin one depends on how much music means to you. What would you want from your life if you genuinely believed that achieving the things you are pursuing would not produce the satisfaction you expect? And does some part of you already know that and keep going anyway? Emil Cioran, the Romanian philosopher who updated pessimism for the 20th century, wrote books full of bleak assessments of existence while also clearly enjoying the act of writing them. His prose is beautiful in a specifically nihilistic way, making you feel that he found the whole situation somewhat funny as well as dark. He once wrote that without music, life would be a mistake, which only works as a line if you find both music and existence simultaneously worth taking seriously. Whether pessimism as a philosophical position maps onto pessimism as a lived experience is not obvious. Some of the most cheerful people hold deeply pessimistic views about the structure of existence, and some of the most miserable people hold optimistic ones. The philosophy and the mood are not the same thing. What pessimism demands is a kind of honesty about the ratio. Not just your good days versus bad days, but the ratio of well-being to suffering across all conscious life, including the vast amount of animal suffering that happens outside human awareness. When you include everything that experiences pain, starves, gets sick, and is hunted, the optimistic calculation becomes much harder to maintain. Most people do not include all of that in their everyday assessment. They are assessing their own life, not all life. And on that narrower question, most people, most of the time, find the answer is yes. That is itself meaningful, even if Schopenhauer would say it is just the will doing its job of keeping you going, regardless of whether going is actually worthwhile. What is the most honest assessment you can give of the ratio of suffering to well-being in your own life? And how different would that ratio need to be before you would revise your basic orientation toward continuing? Antinatalism. David Benatar is a South African philosopher who has written what is probably the most rigorous and least comfortable argument against having children. Not a practical argument about the expense or the time or the environmental impact. A philosophical argument that bringing any new person into existence is, by its nature, a harm to that person, regardless of how good their life turns out to be. His argument hinges on what he calls the asymmetry. When you consider bringing a potential person into existence, 4 things are relevant. The pleasures they will experience, which is a bad thing, the absence of those pleasures if they are never born, which is not bad because there is no one who is deprived of them, and the absence of those pleasures if they are never born, which is good because it is a genuine benefit, even though there is no one to enjoy that benefit. The asymmetry between these 4 outcomes, Benatar argues, means that non-existence is always better for the potential person than existence. Bringing them into existence guarantees they will suffer, which is bad. Not bringing them into existence avoids that suffering, which is good. Not bringing them into existence also means they miss out on pleasures, but this is not bad because there is no one who is deprived. The absence of bad things is good. The absence of good things is only bad when there is someone who is deprived of them. Most people find this argument unconvincing on first encounter, and many philosophers have challenged it. The main objection is that the asymmetry Benatar identifies is not obviously real, that the absence of pleasures can be bad even without a subject who is deprived. If you accept that premise, the argument collapses, and most people do accept something like that premise in their everyday moral thinking. But the argument is harder to fully dismiss than it appears, not because the asymmetry is obviously correct, but because it forces you to think carefully about why you believe what you believe about the ethics of creating new people. Most people have children without much philosophical reflection on whether the child will, on balance, be glad to have been born. They assume the answer is yes, because they themselves are generally glad to have been born. But that assumption does not survive careful examination for everyone. What makes antinatalism genuinely dark is not the argument about asymmetry. It is the underlying observation that all conscious beings will suffer. Not possibly or in some circumstances, but certainly and to varying degrees, because suffering is woven into the structure of biological existence. You can reduce suffering. You cannot eliminate it. And whatever you provide for a child, you also provide the certainty of pain, loss, decline, and death. Whether that is enough to make it wrong to have children is something most people answer no. And most philosophers who have examined the argument find ways to reject it. But it does raise the question of why you would bring someone into existence if you could not guarantee their experience would be positive. And when you try to answer that question honestly, it usually turns out the reasons are more about the parent than the child. If you have children or plan to, what is your actual reason? And how much of that reason is about what the child will experience versus what the experience of having a child will give you? There is a version of the antinatalist concern that is softer and more common than Benatar's formal argument, and that most parents encounter at some point without necessarily naming it. You bring a child into a world you know is difficult. You cannot protect them from everything. Some of what they will experience you can help with, some you cannot. And the specific things that will cause them the most suffering are often impossible to predict or prevent. Most parents respond to this by deciding that the goods outweigh the harms, that a life with suffering is still, for most people, better than no life. And in most cases, the people they create seem to agree, at least provisionally and at least most of the time. The will to continue, for most people, most of the time, is stronger than the wish to never have existed. But Benatar's point is that this reasoning has a structural problem. You cannot ask someone whether they are glad to have been born before you have already made the decision for them. You create them and then find out. And if they turn out not to be glad, there is nothing you can do about it. The asymmetry, whatever you think of its formal presentation, points at something real about the one-sidedness of the decision. What makes the antinatalist position genuinely difficult to dismiss is not the asymmetry argument specifically. It is the more basic observation that you are making an irreversible decision about another person's entire existence without their consent, based on predictions about their experience that you cannot verify. For almost any other major decision affecting someone else, we would require at minimum that they could object. Children cannot object because they do not exist until the decision has been made. Whether this makes having children wrong is something almost nobody concludes even after sitting with the argument carefully. But it does change how you might think about what you owe a child once you have created them. What would it mean to take seriously the idea that you made a major decision on someone else's behalf without their ability to consent, and that your obligation to them is at least partly a consequence of that unilateral choice, and whether that framing changes anything about how you hold the relationship? Or nothing. Benatar's asymmetry. Most discussions of David Benatar's antinatalism focus on the conclusion that it is wrong to bring new people into existence, and on whether that conclusion is acceptable. But the argument underneath it, the asymmetry he identifies between presence and absence of good and bad things, is worth examining separately because it reveals something genuinely strange about how we think about non-existence. Benatar asks you to consider two scenarios. Scenario 1 is a world where a person exists and experiences both pleasures and pains. Scenario 2 is a world where that person never exists and experiences neither pleasures nor pains. Now compare four aspects of these scenarios. The pains in Scenario 1 are bad. The absence of those pains in Scenario 2 is good. The pleasures in Scenario 1 are good. The absence of those pleasures in Scenario 2 is not bad, or at least not bad in the same way as the absence of pleasures would be bad for someone who exists and is deprived of them. On Benatar's reading, this asymmetry means that non-existence is always preferable to existence from the perspective of the potential person, because the absence of suffering is genuinely good, even when there is no one to benefit from it, while the absence of pleasure is only bad if there is someone being deprived. Where the argument gets genuinely interesting is in pushing on why we might accept or reject this asymmetry. Most people's intuition is that the absence of pleasures is also bad, even without a subject, because the pleasures themselves have value. On that view, a world containing joy is better than a world without it, regardless of who is there to experience it. And if that is right, then the asymmetry collapses and the argument fails. But Benatar can push back. Consider why you think it is bad that someone is not born who would have had a wonderful life. You probably think it is not bad, or at least much less bad than the premature death of someone who already exists. Most people do not grieve potential people who were never conceived. They do grieve the deaths of actual people. This suggests we already treat absence of good things differently, depending on whether there is a subject who is deprived. Whether that intuition accurately reflects a genuine moral asymmetry or just a cognitive bias toward the actual over the potential is itself contested, and the answer matters a great deal because it determines whether Benatar's argument has any force at all. What is genuinely unsettling about the asymmetry argument is not its conclusion, but the way it exposes how little we have thought through the ethics of creating people. We create them with assumptions and hopes and guesses about what their life will be like. We cannot ask them. We cannot know in advance. And when things go wrong for them, we often respond with something like, "Well, nobody promised you a good life," which is true, but also reveals that we never quite believed our own implicit promise that their existence would be worth it. Whether that is a reason not to have children, or just a reason to think more carefully about what you owe the ones you have, is not something the asymmetry argument settles. What it does is make the implicit promise explicit, and then ask what you actually mean by it. What did you implicitly promise to the people who were brought into existence partly because of you, directly or indirectly? And how confident are you that you have kept it, or that keeping it is even within your power? There is a version of the asymmetry argument that applies to decisions you make on your own behalf, not on behalf of future people, and it has the same structure, without the ethical complications of creating someone else. Every significant decision you make commits a version of you to experiencing what follows. When you move to a new city, take a new job, enter a relationship, end one, you are making a choice on behalf of all the future days that will come after. Those future days will contain good things and bad things that you cannot fully predict. And the decision you are making now will shape which future days are available to you. The asymmetry shows up here in how we think about regret. Regretting a choice you made is painful because you can see the bad that resulted. Not regretting a choice you did not make is easy because there is no specific bad outcome to attach the regret to. You do not usually feel the good you missed by not taking a particular job or not staying in a particular city, because the absence of that good has no vivid presence in your actual experience. But you feel very vividly the bad outcomes of the choices you did make. This is Benatar's asymmetry in personal decision-making. The bad things that happen as a result of your choices are experienced directly. The good things you miss because you made a different choice are mostly invisible. Which means your experience of your own life is systematically biased toward the costs of acting and away from the costs of not acting. Whether this means you should act less, or just that you should weight the costs and benefits differently is not obvious. But it does mean that the experience of regret is probably not a reliable guide to whether a decision was actually wrong. What is a decision you regret that you might not regret if you could see clearly what you would have missed by choosing differently? And is there a way to know? Benatar's asymmetry is easier to dismiss than to refute. The quick dismissal is that existence is obviously worth it for most people. Actual refutation requires showing that absence of good things is as bad as presence of bad things, even without anyone being deprived, which is harder to establish than it sounds. And if you cannot establish it, the argument does not disappear. It sits between what you assumed and what you can actually justify. The asymmetry applies to regret too, and to most evaluations of your own past. Zapffel's over-evolution. Peter Wessel Zapffe was a Norwegian philosopher and mountaineer who published an essay in 1933 called The Last Messiah, and in it he proposed one of the more unusual accounts of human consciousness and why it produces so much suffering. His argument was not that life is hard or that circumstances are cruel. His argument was that human beings evolved too much, that consciousness exceeded what biological existence requires, and that the excess is the source of most of what makes being human specifically painful. Other animals, in Zapffel's view, do not suffer from existential dread because their consciousness is calibrated to the demands of survival. They perceive enough to navigate their environment and respond to threats. They do not have the excess cognitive capacity to sit and contemplate their own mortality, the meaninglessness of their struggles, the inevitability of death, the impermanence of everything they care about. That kind of reflection requires more cognitive capacity than biology strictly needs, and humans somehow developed it. The result, Zapffe argued, is a creature that is structurally unfit for the conditions of its own existence. We have the capacity to see clearly that nothing we do ultimately matters, that we will die, that the people we love will die, that everything we build will eventually come to nothing. But we also have the biological drives of an animal that needs to eat and reproduce and secure its position. We are animals who can think about what it means to be an animal, and the thinking makes the being unbearable in ways it would not be if we could not do the thinking. His proposed response was a list of strategies he believed humans use to manage this over-endowment. Anchoring, which is attaching yourself firmly to some value or goal or identity that provides orientation. Distraction, which is filling consciousness with enough activity that the underlying awareness cannot surface. Sublimation, which is channeling the excess consciousness into art, philosophy, or science. And isolation, which is simply not thinking about the hard parts. What makes Zapffe's account interesting is that he was not recommending these strategies. He was describing them as the coping mechanisms of a creature that should not exist in its current form. The strategies work, in the sense that most people manage to live and function, but they are responses to a problem that Zapffe believed was irreducible, the mismatch between what human consciousness can perceive and what biological existence can bear. His own response to this was to choose not to have children, not out of antinatalism exactly, but out of what he described as a kind of compassion, a reluctance to pass on the burden of over-evolved consciousness to another being. Whether Zapffe was right about the mismatch is not obvious. It is possible that the cognitive excess he describes is also the source of everything humans have built, of art and science and philosophy and love, and that the suffering it produces is the price of those things, rather than a sign that consciousness has gone wrong. But his question remains. If you could have a version of consciousness that was calibrated perfectly to what you actually need, that did not go further than biological existence requires, would you want it? And would the you who wanted it be the same you who has the capacity to want things at all? Something in Zapffer's framework maps onto a common experience without requiring his full philosophical apparatus. Most people have had the experience of knowing something about their situation that made it harder to bear, not because the situation changed, but because the knowing was the problem. Understanding what you are going through, clearly enough to see it in its full context, is sometimes worse than not understanding it. A person who does not know that their relationship is unhealthy might not suffer as much as a person who can see it clearly and cannot leave. A person who does not know that their career is going nowhere might not feel the weight of it as heavily as a person who can analyze exactly why it is not going to change. The consciousness that allows you to see clearly is the same consciousness that makes what you see harder to bear. Zapffer's over-evolution is, in part, a claim that this is not just incidental, but structural. Human consciousness is not a tool perfectly matched to the conditions of human life. It is a tool capable of far more than those conditions require, and the excess capacity is directed inward and upward toward things that cannot be resolved and cannot be turned off. You can practice Zapffer's 4 strategies. You can anchor yourself to something, distract yourself with enough activity, sublimate the excess into creative work, or simply try not to think about the hardest things. Most people do some version of all 4 in various proportions, and most people find that none of them fully close the gap between what consciousness can perceive and what existence can provide in response to what it perceives. Whether that gap is a design flaw or the price of being the kind of thing that can notice design flaws at all is a question that does not have a clean answer. What would you sacrifice to have a consciousness that did not exceed what your life could satisfy? And if the answer is nothing, does that mean you have found a way to live with the excess, or that you have found a way not to notice it yet? Zapffe climbed mountains until he was in his 90s. He seemed to find in the physical demands of altitude and weather something that engaged consciousness fully enough that the excess had somewhere to go. Whether that is a solution or a very good distraction is something he probably knew and did not fully resolve. Mainländer's redemption. Philipp Mainländer was a 19th century German philosopher who took Schopenhauer's pessimism and pushed it somewhere Schopenhauer would not go. Where Schopenhauer recommended resignation and aesthetic withdrawal as responses to the suffering of existence, Mainländer concluded that the goal of existence was its own annihilation, that the universe was in the process of willing itself into non-being, and that death was not a tragedy, but a release into something better than existence. His central idea was that the will to live, the blind striving force Schopenhauer had identified as the engine of all existence, was gradually weakening. God, in Mainländer's framework, was not the creator of a good universe, but rather had destroyed himself in order to create it. The universe we inhabit is the fragmenting remains of a divine suicide, and everything in it, including conscious life, is moving toward the same dissolution. Existence is a path toward non-existence, and the path is the purpose. Mainländer published his major work, The Philosophy of Redemption, in 1876. He committed suicide the following day, at the age of 34, apparently having experienced his own philosophical position as something to be enacted, rather than merely described. What makes Mainländer interesting, rather than just morbid, is the seriousness with which he pursued his conclusion. Most pessimistic philosophies acknowledge the darkness of existence, while still affirming the value of going on. Mainländer did not. He followed his argument wherever it led, and then he followed himself. Whether that makes his philosophy more honest, or just more dangerous, depends on how you think about the relationship between philosophical conclusions and how you should live. His work influenced several later thinkers, including Emil Cioran, who found in Mainländer's cosmic pessimism a framework for his own bleakest observations. Whether that influence was a good thing for those thinkers, or just provided philosophical scaffolding for something that might have been better left unsupported, is not easy to assess. What is genuinely interesting about Mainländer philosophically, setting aside the disturbing biographical facts, is his claim that non-existence is not just neutral, but positively better than existence. Most philosophers who argue that life is net negative still hold that non-existence is simply an absence, not a good. Mainländer held that annihilation was the goal and the relief, that the universe is tending towards something that is, in some sense, better than what it currently is, Whether you find that idea monstrous or strangely comforting probably tells you something about where you are right now. Most people, encountering it, feel that it is wrong in a way they cannot fully articulate. The intuition that existing is better than not existing is so basic that arguments against it tend to feel like violations rather than conclusions. And yet Mainländer made the argument carefully. He did not stumble into nihilism through despair. He reasoned toward it, and then he acted on it. What would it take for you to conclude that non-existence was not just neutral but better? And is the fact that you do not currently believe that a piece of evidence about the world or about your relationship to it? There is a version of Mainländer's framework that appears in ordinary human experience without the theological apparatus of divine suicide and cosmic annihilation. Most people, at some point in their lives, have encountered the feeling that stopping would be a relief. Not necessarily the feeling that they want to die, but a more diffuse sense that the continuation of effort, of consciousness, of caring, of having to keep being someone, would be welcome to pause. Whether that feeling is a sign of depression, of exhaustion, of a genuine response to difficult circumstances, or of something deeper and more structural, is not always clear from inside the feeling. Mainländer would say it is a sign of the will to live weakening in the healthy direction, the universe doing what it is supposed to do through the consciousness that has evolved to experience it. Most psychologists and most people would say it is a signal that something needs to change. What makes Mainländer's position genuinely dangerous as a framework is precisely that it can be used to interpret a symptom as a truth. The feeling that existence is too much, that not being would be better, is real. But the philosophical argument that this feeling accurately perceives the nature of things rather than reflecting a state that can change is a leap that Mainländer makes without sufficient justification. Feelings of exhaustion are not revelations about the cosmos. They are states of a system under pressure. Whether the distinction matters depends on what you do with the feeling. Treated as information about a state that can change, it can point toward rest or help or a different way of being. Treated as a philosophical insight about the superiority of non-existence, it can do something much worse. Mainländer's philosophy is worth knowing about not because his conclusion is right, but because it reveals how far philosophical pessimism can go when it follows its own logic without friction. And the friction it needed was probably not more philosophy. What would you say to someone who felt the way Mainländer apparently felt? And what would change about your answer if you thought they might be right? Mainländer published his work and left the day after. He seemed to experience his own philosophy as something to complete rather than inhabit. Most people who encounter his ideas do not follow him, but the ideas are worth knowing as a marker of where pessimism goes when it is taken all the way. Lovecraftian Cosmicism. H.P. Lovecraft was a writer of horror fiction in the early 20th century who developed a specific philosophical position that he wove through his stories and also articulated in letters and essays. He called it Cosmicism, and it is less a system of thought than a sustained emotional and intellectual response to what he believed the universe actually was. The core of Cosmicism is indifference, not malice, not punishment, not divine wrath, just the complete, total, absolute indifference of the cosmos to anything that happens in it. The universe is not hostile to human beings. Hostile would require caring. Hostility is a relationship. What Cosmicism proposes is something starker, that humans are so irrelevant to the scale and nature of the universe that the universe has no relationship to them at all, not even a negative one. Lovecraft's fiction dramatizes this through encounters with what he called the Old Ones, ancient cosmic entities of immense power who are not evil in any comprehensible sense, but whose very existence is enough to shatter human sanity. Not because they want to destroy humans, but because they simply are. And what they are is so far outside any human framework for understanding reality that the encounter produces madness. The horror in his stories is not the horror of being hunted, it is the horror of being irrelevant. Whether Lovecraft's cosmicism is philosophically rigorous is debatable. He was not writing academic philosophy, but the position he articulates through his fiction is a genuine one, and one that connects to serious philosophical discussions about the meaning of human existence in an indifferent universe. What Cosmicism adds to the conversation is the specific quality of the indifference. Most accounts of cosmic meaninglessness allow that human beings are at least the most complex and interesting things in the corner of the universe they inhabit. Cosmicism goes further. It suggests that there are things in the universe so far beyond human scale and human comprehension that humans are not even the most interesting things in their own galaxy, let alone the cosmos. And encountering those things, really encountering them, would not produce wonder, but dissolution. You can read this as horror, or you can read it as a kind of inverse comfort. If nothing notices you, you are also not accountable to anything. There is no cosmic judgment, no record being kept, no audience that cares what you do or do not do with your brief existence. The same indifference that makes human significance impossible also makes human failure insignificant. Whatever you do or do not do, the universe will continue exactly as it was going to continue. Whether that is liberating or devastating is not something cosmicism decides for you. Lovecraft himself found it devastating. Other people have found something close to freedom in it. The position is the same either way. Only the response differs. What is the thing you are most afraid would happen if nothing in the universe noticed or cared about you? And is it something that has already happened, whether or not you have acknowledged it? Lovecraft's specific genius was translating a philosophical position into a visceral, emotional experience. Reading his stories, even when you can see the philosophical scaffolding clearly, produces a particular feeling that is hard to get from philosophical argument alone. The feeling is something like the sudden removal of a floor you did not know you were standing on. A brief vertigo where the familiar scale of your concerns, your problems, your plans, your relationships suddenly seems very small and very temporary. Most people experience this briefly and then the floor comes back. The ordinary framework of daily life reasserts itself because it has to. You need to eat and sleep and respond to the people around you, and doing those things requires operating at the human scale, which is the only scale you can actually operate at. But Lovecraft was interested in what happens to people, or to characters in his fiction, when the floor does not come back, when the encounter with cosmic indifference is sustained long enough, and is real enough, that the ordinary framework cannot reassemble itself. His characters go mad not because they are weak, but because the thing they have encountered is genuinely incompatible with the maintenance of a coherent human self. What cosmicism does, taken seriously, is change the scale at which you calibrate your concerns. Not to zero, because you still have to live, but lower than most people usually set them. Problems that felt insurmountable reveal themselves to be local and temporary. Ambitions that felt imperative reveal themselves to be, at Lovecraft's scale, essentially decorative. Lovecraft never found the liberating version. His letters describe someone who felt the universe's indifference acutely and personally, even though the whole point of cosmicism is that the indifference is not personal. What is the largest scale at which you can hold your own life without losing the ability to care about it? And is that scale larger or smaller than you would want it to be? Whether the floor comes back after you have really looked at the scale is something each person discovers differently. For some people it comes back stronger, for others it comes back thinner, and for a small number it does not come back in quite the same way at all, which is what Lovecraft was trying to describe and what he seems to have experienced himself. Ligotti's puppet philosophy. Thomas Ligotti is a horror writer and philosopher who published a book called The Conspiracy Against the Human Race in 2010, in which he attempted to write the most honest philosophical account of human consciousness he could produce. What he produced is one of the bleaker texts in recent philosophical literature, and also one of the more unusual, because it is written in the style of literary horror rather than academic philosophy, which gives it a texture that most pessimist arguments lack. Ligotti's central claim is that consciousness is a mistake, not in Zapffer's evolutionary sense, though he draws heavily on Zapffe, but in a more fundamental sense. Consciousness is, in his view, the thing that allows suffering to exist. Without consciousness, there is no experience, and without experience, there is no suffering. The universe without consciousness is not a suffering universe. It is simply what it is, indifferent to itself. Consciousness introduces the possibility of suffering by introducing the capacity to experience things, and then it introduces the certainty of suffering by placing that capacity inside finite biological creatures who have needs that cannot always be met, who age, who lose things, and who die. His view of human beings is captured in a metaphor he returns to repeatedly. We are, he argues, something like puppets, figures moved by forces we do not control and do not fully understand, performing the appearance of agency while being driven by biology and neurochemistry and social conditioning in ways that make the performance of selfhood something very different from the reality of it. Not because we are deceived exactly, but because the self that seems to be doing the choosing is itself a construction of the same unconscious processes that are making the choices. What makes Ligotti's puppetry metaphor interesting is not that it is original. The idea that human selfhood is constructed rather than given has a long history in philosophy and psychology. What is distinctive is the emotional register he brings to it. For Ligotti, the puppet metaphor is not just a philosophical claim about the mechanics of consciousness. It is an expression of horror at what the mechanics imply. We are things that experience being driven, and the experiencing is what makes the being driven unbearable. His recommended response, to the extent he has one, is what he calls an honest assessment, a refusal to construct the kind of buffering narrative that most people use to make existence comfortable. He is suspicious of positive thinking, of self-improvement, of spiritual practice, not because they do not work, but because they work by obscuring the underlying situation. And he would rather see the situation clearly than be comforted by an accurate description of it. Whether that commitment to clarity produces anything better than the buffered version is something Ligotti himself seems uncertain about. His writing does not have the triumphant quality of a thinker who has found the right answer. It has the quality of someone who has looked at something and cannot unsee it, and who has decided that the looking was necessary, even if the seeing is hard. What would you lose, and what would you gain if you removed every buffer between your ordinary experience and the underlying situation Ligotti is describing? And is the answer that you would rather not find out, or that you already have a version of the answer from somewhere in your own life? The puppet metaphor has a specific implication that Ligotti does not always make explicit, but that runs through his writing. If the self is a construction produced by forces that are not the self, then the self's apparent choices are also constructions produced by those same forces. What you think of as your decision-making process, the weighing of options, the formation of intentions, the feeling of making up your mind, is itself produced by processes that are not you making up your mind. The puppet is not pulling its own strings, and there are no strings that are actually yours. This is a version of the hard determinism that appears in many philosophical frameworks, but Ligotti gives it a specific phenomenological quality. He is not just saying that determinism is true in some abstract metaphysical sense. He is describing what it feels like, or what he believes it should feel like, to be a conscious entity that cannot be the source of its own consciousness. The horror is not the determinism. The horror is the awareness of the determinism while being unable to step outside it. Most people, encountering arguments about determinism and the constructed self, experience a brief intellectual recognition and then return to the experience of being a self-making choices. The intellectual understanding does not change the phenomenological experience. You still feel like you are choosing even if you believe the choosing is determined. Ligotti's position is that this gap between the intellectual understanding and the phenomenological experience is itself a symptom of the problem. We know what we are, but we cannot experience ourselves as what we are, because the experience is produced by the very mechanism we are trying to see past. Seeing past it would require stepping outside consciousness, which is not an option available to conscious creatures. Whether that produces horror or just a kind of philosophical vertigo that passes depends on how long you stay with it and how seriously you take the implications. What would change about your sense of yourself if you genuinely believed, not intellectually, but in your bones, that there is no self pulling the strings? And what would stay the same? Ligotti would say whatever stays the same is the puppet doing what puppets do. The hedonic treadmill. Psychologists have a name for a phenomenon that most people discover through experience rather than reading. The hedonic treadmill, also called hedonic adaptation, is the observed tendency for humans to return to a roughly stable level of happiness after major positive or negative life events. You get the promotion, the relationship, the house, the achievement you wanted, and for a while things are genuinely better. And then, gradually, the new situation becomes the baseline. What was exciting becomes ordinary. The happiness level that the new thing produced fades back toward where it was before. The same happens in reverse. People who experience major losses, serious illness, paralysis, the death of someone close, tend to adapt over time in ways that bring them closer to their previous level of well-being than most observers would predict. This is not a denial of suffering. Grief and loss are real and lasting. but the complete destruction of well-being that most people expect major negative events to produce often does not persist as long as anticipated. What the hedonic treadmill reveals is that humans are, in general, worse at predicting how they will feel about future situations than they believe they are. We overestimate how much better we will feel when we get what we want, and how much worse we will feel when we lose what we have. The actual felt experience of most life events is less extreme and shorter in duration than we expect. And then we return to something close to our usual set point. The philosophical problem this creates is not subtle. If you are going to return to roughly the same level of well-being regardless of what you achieve or lose, then the pursuit of specific outcomes as a strategy for producing lasting happiness is structurally compromised. Not impossible. The set point itself can shift, and some experiences and circumstances do produce lasting changes in well-being. But the assumption that getting the particular thing you want will fundamentally change how you feel is, on average, not accurate. Most people know this in theory. Most people experience it repeatedly in practice, get what they wanted, feel the adaptation happen, and then shift their desire to the next thing. Not because they are foolish, but because the hedonic treadmill is not just a cognitive error. It is woven into the neurological machinery of desire and reward. The system is designed to keep you wanting, which means it is designed to prevent the satisfaction of wanting from lasting. Whether this is a design flaw or a feature depends on what you think the system is for. As a biological system for motivating continued engagement with an environment full of things worth engaging with, hedonic adaptation is useful. As a system for producing lasting subjective well-being, it is not particularly functional. What makes the hedonic treadmill philosophically interesting, rather than just psychologically interesting, is that it raises the question of what you are actually pursuing when you pursue the things you pursue. If the felt experience of getting them is going to adapt back toward your baseline, and if the felt experience of losing them is going to do the same, then the outcomes themselves are not providing what you think they are providing. Something else is going on. Some people conclude from this that outcomes do not matter and only the process does. Others conclude that you should pursue things that shift the set point rather than things that just temporarily exceed it. Others find the whole thing so discouraging that they try not to think about it. What are you expecting the next thing you are working toward to give you? And is there evidence from your own history that getting it will produce what you are expecting? Some things that people adapt to include not just the positive experience but also the wanting itself. You adapt to having the thing, but you also adapt to the category of wanting things like it. With wealth, this is particularly clear. People who become significantly wealthier do not just adapt to their income level. They shift what they compare themselves to, what they consider reasonable, and what they want. The treadmill does not just move the destination, it moves the whole terrain. What this means is that hedonic adaptation continuously regenerates the conditions for wanting. You get what you wanted. The wanting adapts. New wanting appears, not for the same things but for things that were invisible before you got what you previously wanted. The treadmill does not bring you back to where you started. It generates the next version of the path. Whether this is tragic or just what it is to be a motivated creature depends on your relationship with the wanting itself. Some people find the wanting painful and would prefer stable contentment. Some find it animating and would not trade it for a rival even if a rival were possible. The hedonic treadmill does not resolve this preference. It just ensures that a rival, in the form of permanent lasting satisfaction, is not available. The question of whether that makes life better or worse than it would be if a rival were possible is something each person answers differently. What would your life feel like if you got everything you currently want and felt 6 months later, more or less as you feel right now? And does that thought make the current wanting feel more or less worth the effort? Hedonic adaptation was observed consistently across very different populations and cultures before it had a name, which suggests it is not a quirk of any particular society. It is a feature of the basic architecture of wanting. The treadmill does not care what you think of it, and it will be running whether you are thinking about it or not. Schopenhauer's will. Arthur Schopenhauer's central idea is worth going deeper into than his pessimism, because the pessimism was the conclusion and the will was the argument. Understanding the will is understanding why Schopenhauer thought what he thought, rather than just knowing that he thought it. Schopenhauer believed that the fundamental nature of reality was not matter or God or reason or anything orderly or purposeful. He believed it was a blind, irrational, striving force that he called the will. Not a will in the sense of an intention or a desire that has a specific object. Something older and more basic than that. A drive toward existence and continuation that has no reason behind it and no goal in front of it. Just the striving itself, all the way down. What humans experience as their own will, their own desires, their own ambitions and fears and appetites is, in Schopenhauer's framework, not really theirs. It is the will expressing itself through them. You did not choose to want the things you want. You did not decide to be afraid of the things that frighten you. You did not select the drives that propel you through life. They arise from something prior to and independent of your individual consciousness. You are, in a very specific sense, a vehicle for something that does not care about you or your experience. The implications of this are significant. If your desires are not really yours in any deep sense, then satisfying them does not produce a genuine good for you, the conscious experiencing creature. It produces a temporary satisfaction of the will's blind striving, which then generates new striving. The feeling of wanting something, getting it, and wanting the next thing is not a failure of your character or a failure to find the right things to want. It is the will doing exactly what the will does, which is to perpetuate itself at all costs. Schopenhauer thought this applied not just to human beings, but to everything. The force of gravity is the will. The growth of plants is the will. Sexual attraction is the will. All of nature is the will expressing itself in different registers, and none of it has a purpose beyond the continuation of the striving itself. Whether this is a compelling metaphysics or just a very elaborate way of describing what biological drives look like from the inside is something philosophers have argued about since he published The World as Will and Representation in 1818. What is harder to dismiss is the phenomenological observation that sits underneath it, the feeling of drivenness, of being pulled toward things and away from others by forces that do not feel entirely chosen, is real and common. Whether Schopenhauer's explanation of it is the right one, the observation is accurate. What he thought followed from this was the possibility of a specific kind of liberation, not through getting what you want, which only feeds the will, not through controlling your desires, through strength of will, which is the will trying to control itself, but through a kind of seeing through the will, a clear recognition of what it is and what it is doing, which he believed could produce something like release. He called it the denial of the will, and he associated it with the highest states in ascetic traditions and in music. Whether that release is actually available through philosophical understanding, or whether it requires something more than understanding, is not something he fully resolved. His own life, with its pleasures and pettiness and resentments, did not look like someone who had achieved the denial of the will. What in your life feels most like the will running through you rather than something you have actually chosen, and does naming it change anything about how it feels? There is a version of Schopenhauer's will that is visible in everyday experience without accepting his metaphysical framework. Most people have had the experience of wanting something intensely, getting it, and then discovering that the wanting was more vivid than the having. The anticipation was richer than the arrival. And then another wanting appeared, as if the previous one was just a placeholder for the next one. Schopenhauer would say this is the will asserting its nature. It cannot be satisfied because satisfaction is not what it is for. It is for continuation, not for arrival. Every satisfaction is temporary because every satisfaction removes the drive that produced it, and the system immediately generates a new drive. You are, in this frame, a vehicle for a process that uses your consciousness to motivate itself but does not share its goals with you. Whether this is a depressing or liberating observation depends on what you do with it. If you were hoping that getting what you want would finally produce lasting contentment, Schopenhauer's framework suggests you are operating under a structural misunderstanding. The contentment is not available at the end of the road of wanting. But if you can stop expecting to arrive, the quality of the journey might change. Not because you have escaped the will, which you probably cannot do, but because you have stopped fighting against its nature. Some people find this helpful. Some find it just adds a philosophical layer to an already uncomfortable experience. Some find that once you name the will and see it running, The wanting feels different, not weaker, but less personal. Less like your failure to be satisfied and more like a feature of what you are. Whether the naming changes anything or just provides company for a feeling that was already there is something you can probably only find out by sitting with it. What would change about your relationship to your own desires if you genuinely believe they were not, in some deep sense, yours? And would that be a relief or a loss? Moral nihilism. Most people assume there are real answers to moral questions, even if those answers are hard to find. Torturing someone for fun is wrong. Helping someone in distress is good. These feel like facts about the world rather than just preferences, the way that 2 + 2 = 4 feels like a fact. Moral nihilism is the position that this feeling is mistaken. Nothing is actually right or wrong. When you say something is wrong, you are not describing a property of the world. You are expressing an attitude or reporting a social convention, but you are not stating something true. This is harder to dismiss than it initially appears. The main challenge is explaining where moral facts would come from and what kind of thing they would be. Physical facts are facts about matter and energy. Mathematical facts are facts about abstract structures and their relationships. Moral facts would have to be facts about rightness and wrongness, which are not obviously the kinds of things that exist in the physical world or the mathematical one. When you look at an act of cruelty and perceive it as wrong, you are perceiving a physical event. Where is the wrongness in that event? What property of the particles involved constitutes it? Philosophers who take moral realism seriously have proposed various answers, but none have achieved anything like consensus. Moral nihilists argue that the persistent difficulty of grounding moral facts in anything real is itself evidence that they do not exist. What moral nihilism does not imply is that anything goes. You can be a moral nihilist and still behave well, still care deeply about people, still find cruelty repugnant and generosity admirable. What changes is the justification structure. You are no longer appealing to moral facts when you explain why you act as you do. You are appealing to what you care about, what your community values, what kind of person you want to be. These are real things. They can motivate genuine behavior, but they do not carry the objectivity that moral realists claim. The practical difference between a moral realist and a moral nihilist who cares about similar things might be very small in daily life. Both might behave similarly and feel similar emotions in response to suffering and injustice. The difference shows up most clearly in how they respond when someone with genuinely different values simply disagrees and will not be moved. A moral realist can say you are wrong. A moral nihilist can only say I disagree, or your values and mine are incompatible. Whether that is a meaningful difference in situations of genuine moral conflict is something people answer very differently. Many people behave as moral realists in their own sphere, while acting as implicit nihilists when confronted with values they find alien. They argue as if their own positions are simply correct, while dismissing positions that conflict with theirs as mere preferences. What explicit moral nihilism does is apply the skepticism consistently. If moral facts do not exist for the values you dislike, they do not exist for the values you hold either. Most people who find moral nihilism intellectually plausible still feel the pull of moral outrage when they witness injustice, still feel guilt when they act against their own values. The gap between the intellectual position and the lived experience is persistent, whether it reveals something about the limits of the position or just about how hard it is to update felt experience to match intellectual conclusions is not something the position itself can settle. Some of the most morally serious people in history have held versions of moral nihilism while continuing to act with great care. The theory and the practice are separable in ways that make you wonder which one is actually doing the work. Caring about people might not need moral facts to sustain it. Or maybe the caring is itself the closest thing to a moral fact that is ever going to be available. What would it change about your relationship to your own values if you genuinely treated them as preferences rather than facts? And is the answer that nothing would change or that something would? Where you land on moral nihilism probably says less about philosophical sophistication than about what you have been through. People who have felt the full weight of genuine wrongdoing tend to find the idea that nothing is actually wrong almost physically difficult to accept. That difficulty is data, even if it is not proof. The feeling of wrongness keeps running whether the theory says it should or not, and that persistence might tell you more about morality than any argument does. Whether you come down on the side of the argument or the side of the feeling probably depends on what the feeling has been attached to in your own life. Moral nihilism tends to be held asymmetrically. People accept it in the abstract, when thinking about why there is no cosmic scorekeeper, and then stop accepting it when it gets personal, when something is done to someone they love, when they need the concept of wrong to carry real weight. Whether that asymmetry is hypocrisy or wisdom is genuinely hard to say. Baudrillard's Simulacra. Jean Baudrillard argued, over several books published in the 1970s and 1980s, that something had happened to reality in modern consumer societies that had never quite happened before. Not that reality had become harder to access, or that people were more confused about it than usual. Something more radical. He argued that reality itself had been replaced by its representations, and that this replacement was so complete that most people could no longer tell the difference, and more unsettlingly, that there was no longer any difference to tell. His starting point was the observation that representations of things have always existed alongside the things they represent. Maps exist alongside territories. Photographs exist alongside the events they depict. Descriptions exist alongside the things they describe. And in each case, the representation was clearly secondary. If the representation diverges from the reality wins. Baudrillard argued that something had changed. Consumer capitalism, mass media, and the proliferation of images had created a situation where representations were no longer secondary, where the image of a thing had become more real, in a specific functional sense, than the thing itself, where copies without originals had displaced whatever originals they were supposed to be copies of. His most famous example involved Disneyland. He argued that Disneyland was not simply a fantasy placed inside a real America. Disneyland was a simulation placed there to make people believe that everything outside it was real, when in fact, the outside was itself already a simulation. The obvious fakeness of Disneyland served to reassure visitors that the rest of the world was genuine. Without that contrast, the unreality of everyday consumer life would be harder to ignore. Whether you find this convincing depends partly on what you think real means, and partly on whether your experience of media-saturated life produces the kind of vertigo Baudrillard is describing. Many people encounter his work and feel a flash of recognition, a sense that he is describing something they have noticed without having the language for. Others find it frustratingly overwritten and ultimately empty. What is harder to dismiss is the more modest version of his observation. Consider how much of what you know about the world you know through representations rather than direct experience. War, poverty, other cultures, historical events, the lives of people very different from your own. Almost all of it reaches you through images, narratives, and framings produced by other people for other purposes. Whether those representations correspond to anything real, and whether you have any meaningful way to check, is genuinely uncertain. Social media makes this particularly visible. What you present online is a curated representation of yourself. What others present is a curated representation of themselves. People go to places because those places photograph well. People pursue experiences partly for their representability, rather than for what the experience itself contains. And the feedback between these representations and actual behavior is real enough that the representations start shaping what happens rather than just describing it. Baudrillard would say the question of whether representations correspond to reality has become unanswerable. Not because reality is hidden, but because the distinction between reality and its representation has collapsed in the places where you most need it. Baudrillard died in 2007, before smartphones were everywhere, before social media had its current shape. What he described in the 1980s was already present in the culture of mass television and advertising. What exists now is something that has accelerated and deepened in ways he would probably have found confirming rather than surprising. Whether you can step outside the simulacra is a question he was skeptical about, not because it is impossible in principle, but because the tools you would use to step outside it are themselves products of it. Your sense of what real looks like, your criteria for authenticity, your very idea of what it would mean to have a genuine experience have all been shaped by the system you are trying to evaluate. What makes Baudrillard worth reading, even where he overreaches, is the specific discomfort he is pointing at. Most people have had the experience of doing something and noticing partway through that they are not doing it for themselves, but for the version of themselves they present to others. The experience arrives pre-formatted for documentation. That is the simulacra in operation, not grand and philosophical, but the quiet colonization of immediate experience by representations that already exist before you get there. When was the last time you did something and experienced it only for itself, with no part of your attention on how it would be described or remembered or shared? And whether that is a new constraint or just what self-consciousness has always been, you might be able to tell from your own life if you look closely enough. Baudrillard was accused of hiding thin observations behind difficult prose, and some of that is fair. But the core observation that representations can become more real in their effects than whatever they represent is not obscure. You can feel it any given Tuesday if you pay attention to what is actually shaping your choices versus what you would say is shaping them. Most people find at least one version of this in their own life without having to look very hard. Gnosticism and the Demiurge. Most religious traditions, when they posit a creator god, imagine that creator as benevolent. The world might contain suffering, but the creator intended it differently or allows the suffering for reasons beyond human comprehension. Gnosticism, a cluster of religious and philosophical movements that flourished in the early centuries of the Common Era, proposed something considerably darker. The creator of the material world was not the true God. It was an inferior, flawed, or in some accounts actively malevolent being called the Demiurge. And the world it created reflects its nature. The Demiurge in Gnostic cosmology is not Satan, not an evil force opposed to a good God. The Demiurge is more disturbing than that. It is the creator, and it is simply not good at what it does, or it is good at what it does, but what it does is the construction of a trap. The material world, on this reading, is not a flawed version of something that could have been better. It is designed to keep conscious beings imprisoned in matter, cycling through birth and death and suffering, unable to perceive the higher reality that the Gnostics believed existed beyond the Demiurge's creation. What makes Gnosticism philosophically interesting, rather than just historically curious, is the coherence of its response to the problem of evil. If you believe the world was created by an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God, you have to explain why the world contains so much suffering. This is the theodicy problem, and every mainstream religion has struggled with it for centuries. Gnosticism sidesteps the problem entirely. The world is full of suffering because the Creator is not all-powerful, not all-knowing, and not perfectly good. The world is exactly what you would expect from a being like the Demiurge. The true God, in Gnostic belief, is remote, silent, and not the author of the material world. Human beings contain a spark of this true divine, trapped inside material bodies created by the Demiurge. Salvation, in Gnostic terms, is not moral improvement or divine grace in the usual sense. It is gnosis, knowledge, a direct experiential understanding of your true nature and origin, which allows you to perceive past the Demiurge's creation toward the higher reality from which you came. Whether any of this is literally true is a separate question from whether the framework captures something real about the experience of being alive in a world that frequently feels indifferent or actively hostile to human flourishing. Many people, without knowing anything about Gnosticism, have had the intuition that whoever or whatever is running this show is not particularly competent or benevolent, that the design of human experience seems careless in ways that an actually good creator would not have permitted. The Demiurge is one way of giving that intuition a framework. Not a comforting framework, but a coherent one. The world is like this because the thing that made it is like this. And whatever you are at your deepest level is not from here. Whether the idea of a spark of higher origin trapped in matter resonates as something true to your experience, or just as an ancient cosmology that has interesting literary descendants, is something only you can assess. What would it change about how you relate to the world if you genuinely believed you were something that did not belong here, passing through rather than having arrived? And would that feel like a loss or a kind of relief? Gnosticism had a wide range of variations, and different schools described the Demiurge differently. Some saw it as actively malevolent, deliberately trapping souls in matter. Others saw it as simply ignorant, a being that believed itself to be the highest God because it had never encountered anything higher, whose creation reflected its ignorance rather than any malice. The Demiurge who does not know it is the Demiurge is, in some ways, a stranger and more uncomfortable figure than one that knows exactly what it is doing. What the ignorant Demiurge suggests is a universe whose creator is confused about its own nature and therefore creates a confused world. A world that has the structure of meaning, that pushes you towards seeking purpose and connection and understanding, but that does not actually provide these things in any reliable way. Not because they have been withheld maliciously, but because the thing that made the world did not fully understand what it was making. Gnosticism was declared heretical by early Christianity, and most of its texts were destroyed. What survived did so partially through chance. The Nag Hammadi library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, restored a substantial body of Gnostic texts and generated a revival of scholarly and popular interest in these ideas. What does it tell you that the idea of a flawed or hostile creator has appeared independently in so many different cultures and traditions? And whether you find it disturbing or strangely validating probably depends on how the world has been treating you lately. Thanatos. Sigmund Freud spent most of his career building a theory of the mind around the concept of eros, the life drive, the force that pushes organisms towards survival, reproduction, connection, and the creation of larger and more complex structures. Near the end of his life, in a book called Beyond the Pleasure Principle, published in 1920, he proposed that eros had a counterpart. He called it the death drive, and later writers named it Thanatos, after the Greek personification of death. Freud had noticed something in his clinical work that did not fit cleanly into his earlier framework. Patients with traumatic experiences returned to them compulsively, not to master them or heal from them, but seemingly just to repeat them. Soldiers with combat trauma dreamed of the battle not in disguised symbolic form, but directly and repeatedly. People reenacted destructive relationship patterns even when they knew what they were doing. There was something in human behavior that seemed to move not toward pleasure and survival, but toward repetition and return, toward an earlier state of things. His explanation was the death drive. He believed that all organic life contained a drive toward returning to the inorganic state from which it came. Living things are organized matter that wants, at some level, to become disorganized again. Eros fights against this by pushing toward complexity and connection. Thanatos pulls in the opposite direction, toward simplicity, dissolution, and the end of tension. In individuals, the death drive expresses itself as aggression, self-destructiveness, the compulsion to repeat painful patterns, the pull toward risk, the strange relief some people feel when things finally fall apart after being maintained through enormous effort. Not that anyone consciously wants these things. The death drive, in Freud's framework, operates below the level of conscious desire. It is not something you choose. It is something that acts through you. Whether Freud was right about this specific biological claim is something most modern psychologists are skeptical of. The death drive is one of his more speculative ideas and does not fit well with what we now understand about evolutionary biology and neurochemistry. As a specific scientific claim about the structure of organic life, it has not held up. But as a description of a phenomenon, as a name for something observable in human behavior, it is harder to dismiss. People do repeat painful patterns. People do seek out conflict and destruction in ways that seem to work against their stated interests. Self-sabotage is real and common enough that any psychology that cannot account for it is missing something. Whether Thanatos as a biological drive is the right explanation, or whether it is better explained by other mechanisms, the explanation is less important than the acknowledgement that the phenomenon exists. Something in human experience pulls toward repetition and dissolution rather than exclusively toward growth and flourishing. What patterns in your own life have you noticed repeating despite your intention to change them? And is the explanation that you have not tried hard enough, or that something else is running in a direction you have not fully accounted for? There is a version of Thanatos that shows up in ordinary life without any clinical or theoretical framing. Have you ever had something going well and noticed an impulse to disrupt it? Not because the disruption would improve anything, not because you had identified a real problem, but just because the stability had a quality of tension to it that the disruption would release. Not consciously wanting things to go wrong, just a strange pull toward the moment when the effort of maintaining something could finally stop. That pull is what Freud was trying to name. The drive toward the end of tension, which is also the drive toward the end of things. Maintaining anything requires effort. Letting go releases that effort. And something in the organism knows this and is drawn toward the release even when the rational mind is committed to maintaining. Freud built Thanatos into his theory late in life, and many colleagues resisted it. They thought he was overcorrecting, projecting something onto human nature that did not need a separate drive to explain. But he insisted. He had seen too many people work against their own interests in ways that pleasure-seeking alone could not account for. Whether he was right to give it the weight he gave it is debatable. That the phenomenon he was naming is real is harder to argue with. What is the thing in your life you are currently working to maintain through significant effort? And is there any part of you that is tired enough of the effort that the thought of its ending, even badly, carries any trace of relief? The answer, honestly given, probably tells you something worth knowing. Panopticism. Jeremy Bentham designed a prison in the late 18th century that he called the Panopticon. The design was simple, and the implication was unsettling. All cells were arranged in a circle around a central watchtower. From the tower, a guard could see every cell. From the cells, prisoners could not see whether the tower was occupied. The architectural point was that you did not need anyone actually watching at any given moment. You only needed the prisoners to know that they might be watched at any moment. The possibility of observation was enough to produce the behavior of the observed. Michel Foucault used Bentham's panopticon in his 1975 book Discipline and Punish as a metaphor for how modern societies exercise power. Not through direct force, not through visible coercion, but through the internalization of surveillance. You behave as if you are being watched because you cannot be sure you are not, and over time, you continue behaving that way even when you are certain no one is watching, because the watching has moved inside. Foucault argued that modern institutions, schools, hospitals, factories, armies, prisons, all operate on panoptic principles. They arrange people so that behavior is visible and accessible, and they produce individuals who regulate themselves according to norms they have absorbed through constant exposure to the gaze of others. The power of the panopticon is not that it watches you, it is that it trains you to watch yourself. Whether you find this framework convincing as a description of modern society depends partly on how much you notice this mechanism operating in your own life. Most people, if they pay attention, can identify contexts where they behave differently because they might be observed. Where they clean their language, moderate their behavior, present a curated version of themselves, not because they have been told to, but because the possibility of an audience is always present. Social media has made this dynamic explicit in a way that Foucault, writing in the 1970s, was only beginning to see. Every post is written for a potential audience. Every image is selected for its projected reception. The audience may not be watching at the moment of posting, but the anticipation of the audience shapes what is posted and what is not. And this shapes, over time, what you do in the first place. The panoptic individual does not just perform for others, they perform for themselves, having internalized an imaginary audience that evaluates their behavior, even in private. The voice that tells you not to do something even when no one would ever know is partly this internalized watcher. Not conscience exactly, though the two are related. More like an internalized surveillance system that runs continuously and evaluates everything. Whether this is liberation or constraint depends on what the norms being enforced are. A panoptic system enforcing kindness and competence is different from one enforcing obedience and conformity. The mechanism is the same. The content is what varies. What behavior would you change if you knew with certainty that no one, including any god or any future version of yourself, would ever know? And what does the gap between that behavior and your actual behavior tell you about who is watching you from the inside? There is a version of panopticism that operates at a level more intimate than social media or institutional surveillance. Most people carry an internal audience with them at all times, not an abstract audience but specific people whose judgment matters. A parent, a mentor, a peer group, a romantic partner past or present. When you make a decision, that internal audience is consulted, often without conscious awareness. You are not just deciding. You are deciding as someone being observed by people whose opinions you have absorbed. Foucault's point about the panopticon was not that surveillance is bad. It was that surveillance produces a particular kind of subject. A person who regulates themselves according to an internalized norm and who eventually cannot clearly distinguish between what they actually want and what the internalized audience approves of. Foucault was not making a nostalgic argument about some pre-modern time when people were free of this. Disciplinary power through internalized surveillance is a specific historical development with a specific shape that can be described and understood. Understanding it does not dissolve it, but it changes your relationship to the voices that tell you how to behave when no one is watching. Some of those voices are worth keeping. Some are running on norms you absorbed before you were old enough to evaluate them. Knowing the difference requires attention most people do not make time for. The Panopticon, in that way, also trains you to stay busy enough that the examination of its own mechanisms is always deferred. Who is in your internal audience? And are they watching you the way someone who genuinely wants good things for you would watch, or some other way entirely? The Banality of Evil. In 1961, Hannah Arendt attended the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Eichmann was one of the chief architects of the logistics of the Holocaust, responsible for organizing the transportation of millions of people to extermination camps. Arendt, as a political philosopher and a Jewish woman who had herself fled Nazi Germany, expected a monster. What she found was something she found more disturbing. Eichmann was ordinary. He was not unintelligent, but he was not remarkable either. He had not joined the Nazi Party out of ideological fervor. He had joined for career reasons because it seemed like the organization that was going somewhere. He had organized mass murder not out of hatred, but out of a desire to do his job well and to advance. He consistently described his actions in bureaucratic language, talked about following orders and meeting quotas and managing logistics, and seemed genuinely unable or unwilling to engage with the moral weight of what those logistics had produced. Arendt coined the phrase "the banality of evil" to describe what she saw. Not that evil was unimportant or small. She meant that one of the most significant evils in human history had been carried out not by demons or ideological fanatics, but by someone whose defining characteristic was a failure of thinking. Eichmann did not think about what he was doing from the perspective of the people affected by it. He did not think about it morally at all. He thought about it administratively. Her argument was controversial and remains so. Some critics argued that she underestimated Eichmann's actual anti-Semitism and that he was more of a true believer than her portrait suggested. Others argued that her concept of the banality of evil excused perpetrators by reducing their agency. The debate about Eichmann's inner life continues among historians, but the broader philosophical point, separated from the specific case of Eichmann, has proved durable. The capacity to participate in systematic harm without experiencing it as harm, by focusing on your role in a system rather than on the system's effects on people, is not rare. Ordinary people can do terrible things when those things are organized bureaucratically and when the connection between their specific action and the harm produced is sufficiently obscured. History provides examples well beyond the Holocaust. Ordinary people have participated in slavery, in colonialism, in the logistics of famine, in systems that produced enormous harm, not because they were monsters, but because they were doing their jobs and not thinking too hard about what their jobs were part of. What makes Arendt's observation genuinely uncomfortable is that it does not require extraordinary circumstances. The same mechanism operates at much smaller scales in ordinary institutions. You can participate in a system that produces harm, doing your part efficiently and professionally, without ever confronting what your part contributes to. What system are you part of that you have not looked at carefully enough to know what your participation contributes to? And if you looked, what do you think you would find? Arendt's concept has an application to everyday moral life that is easy to overlook because it does not require anything as extreme as Eichmann's situation. Every institution of sufficient size creates roles that are defined by their function rather than their effects. You are the accountant, not the person who decides what the money funds. You are the logistics coordinator, not the person who decides what gets transported. You are the marketing writer, not the person who decides what claims are made. Each role comes with a focus on doing the role well, which is a focus that can crowd out the question of what the role is serving. Thinking, in Arendt's sense, is not intelligence. It is the specific act of judging your actions from the perspective of their effects on others, of stepping outside the role and asking what the role is actually producing. Arendt believed that thinking in this specific sense was a moral act, not thinking about abstract principles, but thinking concretely about what your actions produce for specific people. She believed Eichmann was guilty not only of what he did, but of a fundamental failure to think in this sense. What makes it reproducible is that it does not require any unusual psychology, no hatred required, no cruelty, just the ordinary human tendency to focus on the immediate task rather than the larger structure in which the task is embedded. And that tendency is present in virtually everyone, in virtually every institutional context, at virtually every level of seriousness. How often do you think about what your daily activities produce for people you cannot see? And what would need to change for that question to feel more urgent than it currently does? Scientific determinism. Every thought you have ever had was produced by your brain. Your brain is a physical object. Physical objects obey physical laws. Physical laws, at the level of classical mechanics, are deterministic. Given the complete state of the universe at any moment, every subsequent state follows necessarily, which means the thought you are having right now, and the thought you will have next, and every decision you will make for the rest of your life were already determined at the moment of the Big Bang. Scientific determinism is the position that this chain of reasoning is correct, or at least that the version of it that survives quantum mechanics is close enough to correct that free will, as most people understand it, does not exist. You did not choose to want what you want. You did not choose to be the person who makes the choices you make. The choices feel free because you are experiencing them from the inside, but from the outside, from a sufficiently informed perspective, everything you will do could in principle be predicted from prior causes. Quantum mechanics introduces genuine randomness into physical processes, which is sometimes taken as making room for free will. But randomness is not freedom. A decision made partly by random quantum noise is not more free in any meaningful sense than one made by deterministic physical laws. Randomness and determination are both cases of your choices, not originating in some uncaused free agent. They both leave the self as something that happens rather than something that does. Whether determinism is actually true in the relevant sense is contested. Some philosophers argue that free will is compatible with determinism, that you can be free in the only sense that matters, while also being causally determined. On compatibilist views, what matters is whether your actions flow from your own desires and values, rather than being externally coerced. If they do, you are free, even if those desires and values were themselves produced by prior causes. Others find this unsatisfying. If your desires and values were produced by causes you did not choose, including your genes, your upbringing, your early experiences, your neurological architecture, then acting on those desires and values does not seem like freedom in the sense that moral responsibility requires. The compatibilist seems to be redefining freedom rather than defending it. What makes scientific determinism uncomfortable to actually live with, rather than just to discuss, is the implication for responsibility. If you could not have done otherwise than you did, in what sense are you responsible for what you did? If the person who hurt you could not have done otherwise, in what sense does blame make sense? If your failures were produced by causes prior to your choices, what is the point of regret? Most people, encountering these questions, continue to experience themselves as making real choices and continue to feel genuine responsibility and genuine regret. Whether that experience is an illusion, a useful fiction, or evidence that the deterministic picture is missing something, is one of the oldest unresolved questions in philosophy. What would you do differently tomorrow if you genuinely believed that everything you were about to do was already determined? And is the answer nothing, which might itself tell you something worth knowing? There is a version of this that operates at the very personal level, and most people have encountered it without having the language for it. When you look back at a decision that shaped your life significantly, the more honestly you examine it, the less it looks like a free choice, and the more it looks like the only outcome that was available given who you were at the time. Your resources, your fears, your understanding of the situation. Given all of that, could you actually have done otherwise? Most people, when they really sit with this question, start to feel the grip of something that looks like determinism necessarily. Something more psychological and local. The you that existed at that moment was going to make the choice it made because of what that you was. What decision in your past would you relate to differently if you genuinely believed you could not have made any other decision at that time? And what would change about how you carry it forward? Scientific determinism is almost universally accepted in physics and neuroscience, and almost universally ignored in how people actually live. The gap between the intellectual position and the lived experience is so large that it functions as a permanent background condition of modern thought, acknowledged and set aside, because there is no obvious alternative. to continuing to act as if you are choosing, even when you believe you are not. Eliminative materialism. Most people, when they try to explain their own behavior, reach for a vocabulary of minds and mental states. You did something because you believed it would help. You felt sad because you lost something. You are motivated by fear, or hope, or love. This vocabulary of beliefs, desires, emotions, intentions, and experiences feels like the most natural and accurate way to describe what is happening inside you. Eliminative materialism is the position that this vocabulary is wrong, not just imprecise or metaphorical. Wrong in the way that talk of vital spirits and phlogiston was wrong, ways of describing things that referred to entities that do not exist and were replaced by better theories. Beliefs do not exist, desires do not exist. Emotions, as folk psychology describes them, do not exist. What exists is neurons firing in patterns, neurotransmitters crossing synapses, electrochemical gradients being maintained and discharged. The language of mental states is a primitive, inaccurate theory of what the brain does, and a mature neuroscience will eventually replace it with something more accurate. Paul and Patricia Churchland are the philosophers most associated with this view, and they have maintained it through decades of criticism with some consistency. Their argument is that folk psychology, the everyday theory of mind that everyone uses without thinking about it, has a very poor track record as a predictive theory. We have been using belief-desire psychology for millennia, and we still cannot reliably predict human behavior from it. A theory with such a poor track record in other domains would have been discarded long ago. The fact that we keep using folk psychology is a sign of how embedded it is, not of how accurate it is. Whether you find eliminative materialism plausible as a scientific claim depends on whether you think folk psychological categories like belief and desire will eventually be vindicated by neuroscience or replaced by something incompatible with them. Most neuroscientists are not eliminative materialists. They believe the folk psychological categories will be retained but grounded in neural processes, in the way that temperature was retained as a concept but grounded in molecular kinetic energy. But the eliminativist challenge is worth sitting with, even if you reject the strong version. How confident are you, really, that the mental states you report, the beliefs and feelings and intentions you name when explaining yourself, accurately reflect what is actually happening in your brain? The neuroscience of self-report suggests that people are frequently wrong about their own mental states. They confabulate, they misremember, they attribute their behavior to reasons that were not the actual causes. The folk psychological vocabulary we use to describe ourselves might be systematically misleading, even if it does not need to be eliminated entirely. What would it change about how you think about yourself if your introspective reports, the things you say about your own feelings and reasons, were not reliable evidence about your actual mental processes? And is the answer that you already suspected this, or that it genuinely unsettles something you had been taking for granted? There is a version of the eliminativist challenge more accessible than the debate about whether beliefs exist. Most people, paying close attention to their own decision-making, notice that the neat explanations they give afterward are cleaner than whatever actually happened. You explain yourself using folk psychological categories. I did this because I felt that, but the actual process often had a messier, less articulate quality. The explanation is a reconstruction, not a transcript. Whether this means folk psychology is false or just incomplete is unclear, but it does suggest that the explanations you give for your own behavior are partly theoretical interpretations imposed on something more complicated. You are not simply reporting what happened. You are generating a story that fits the format you have available. What do you think actually caused the last significant decision you made? And how much of your account is observation versus interpretation versus the narrative format you had available to fill it in? Eliminative materialism is easier to dismiss than to refute. The quick objection is that beliefs obviously exist because you are experiencing one right now. The eliminativist response is that what you are calling a belief is a neural state, and the question is whether the folk psychological category accurately describes that state, or loosely gestures at it, the way phlogiston gestured at chemical reactions. Knowing your introspective reports might be inaccurate does not change what the reports feel like from the inside, but it might change how confidently you hold them, and how readily you accept someone else's confident account of their own motivations. What would change about your interactions with other people if you consistently held in mind that their accounts of their own feelings and reasons were plausible reconstructions rather than accurate reports? And what would that require of you in return, given that your own accounts carry the same caveat? That is a difficult position to hold consistently. Passive nihilism. Active nihilism says nothing matters and therefore everything should be destroyed and remade from scratch. Passive nihilism says nothing matters and therefore why bother? The active nihilist is at least energized by the idea. The passive nihilist is not energized by anything. Not destruction, not creation, not rebellion, not acceptance. Just a kind of flattening of the horizon where things used to be. A state where effort of any kind seems to require a justification that is not available. Friedrich Nietzsche described both types, and he was much more concerned about the passive variety. He believed passive nihilism was the illness of modernity, the condition that arose when traditional systems of meaning, particularly religious ones, lost their hold without being replaced by anything equally compelling. God is dead, he wrote, and the death was not liberation, but a kind of vertigo. The structure that had organized experience and given it weight was gone, and what remained was not freedom, but weightlessness. Passive nihilism is not the same as depression, though it can look similar from the outside and often accompanies it. Depression involves a distortion of experience, a heaviness that feels unwarranted by the actual content of your life. Passive nihilism is more like a conclusion drawn from a clear-eyed assessment. You look at what is available to care about and find that none of it seems worth the effort required to care about it. Not because the world is dark, but because it is neutral. Neutral in a way that does not respond to your investment in it. What distinguishes passive nihilism from simple exhaustion is its philosophical character. Exhausted people want to rest so they can engage again. Passive nihilists are not sure engagement would produce anything worth wanting even after rest. The problem is not energy. The problem is that energy in the service of what is the question that has no satisfying answer. Nietzsche's response to passive nihilism was not to argue that things actually matter in some cosmic sense. He did not believe that either. His response was to argue that humans could generate their own meaning, could will their own values rather than inheriting them, could affirm life precisely because it was without inherent meaning rather than in spite of that. Whether this worked as a solution or just as a description of what psychologically healthy people manage to do without quite knowing how they do it is something the argument leaves open. What passive nihilism actually feels like from the inside varies considerably. For some people it is quiet and cold, a background absence of pull toward anything. For others it comes in waves, periods where the ordinary motivations return, and periods where they drain away and what is left is a kind of waiting. For others still it is almost comfortable, a release from the anxiety of needing things to matter. Whether you have experienced something like this probably depends on the specific arc of your life and what has succeeded or failed to give it weight. What is the thing that currently gives your days a sense of direction? And how would you feel about your life if that thing were taken away and not replaced by anything else? Passive nihilism has an interesting relationship with productivity culture. Societies that place enormous emphasis on output, achievement, and visible progress tend to produce a specific kind of passive nihilist. Someone who understands the game very well and has simply lost any felt connection to the reasons for playing it. They can perform engagement, they know the vocabulary of ambition, they can produce results, but the interior relationship to those results has gone quiet. This is different from burnout, which is a depletion of resources. Passive nihilism is a depletion of conviction. The resources might still be there. The conviction is what has gone. And unlike burnout, which typically responds to rest and recovery, passive nihilism does not obviously respond to anything. You cannot rest your way back to believing things matter. You cannot schedule your way to caring. What can sometimes shift it is contact with something or someone that generates genuine rather than performed investment. Not inspiration in the motivational sense. Something more specific and less controllable. A problem that actually catches you. A person whose situation makes a claim on you that you did not have to talk yourself into accepting. Nietzsche thought the person who had passed through nihilism and come out the other side was someone who had stopped needing meaning to be given and started creating it. Whether that is an achievement available to everyone or a description of a rare temperament is genuinely unclear. Most people oscillate rather than transcend. the nihilism comes and goes rather than being resolved. What would it take for you to genuinely invest in something right now, not because you should, but because you actually want to? And what does the gap between that answer and what you are currently doing tell you? Surveys across many countries show lower reported levels of meaning in younger generations in highly developed consumer societies. Whether that is passive nihilism in the philosophical sense or a different relationship to the metrics being used is debatable. But the prevalence of the experience suggests it is not a rare individual condition, but something specific kinds of social arrangement tend to produce. What that means about the arrangements, the position cannot answer. It can only name what it is describing. And naming something clearly is sometimes a first step, though not always. Voluntary human extinction. The voluntary human extinction movement is exactly what it sounds like. Les Knight founded it in 1991 with a simple, earnest premise. The most compassionate thing humanity could do, both for itself and for every other species on the planet, is to stop reproducing and gradually allow the human population to decline to zero. Not through violence, not through forced sterilization, not through any kind of coercion, voluntarily. One generation simply choosing not to produce the next. Knight is not misanthropic in the usual sense. He does not hate people. He has spent decades promoting his idea with a kind of cheerful consistency that makes him hard to dismiss as simply dark or disturbed. His argument is ecological rather than existential. Humans have driven an enormous number of species to extinction, have disrupted climate systems, have consumed resources at rates that cannot be sustained indefinitely. On his reading, the planet would flourish if given the chance to recover, and giving it that chance requires removing the species doing the damage. Whether you find this position monstrous, understandable, or somewhere in between probably depends on a combination of how seriously you take environmental concerns and how much weight you give to human existence as intrinsically valuable, rather than valuable because of what humans experience and create. Someone who believes human consciousness and culture are extraordinary things worth preserving for their own sake will find the position obviously wrong. Someone who has genuinely absorbed the scale of what industrial civilization has done to ecosystems might find it at least coherent, even if they cannot endorse it. What makes the voluntary version of the argument interesting is the consistency of its ethics. It does not ask anything of anyone that it does not ask equally of everyone. Knight himself has no children. He is not proposing that other people sacrifice something he has kept for himself. Whether you think the sacrifice is worth making is your choice, he would say. He just thinks it is the right one. The argument is sometimes confused with antinatalism, but the two are distinct. Antinatalism, in Benatar's version, is primarily about the harm done by the collective. You might accept one without accepting the other, and many people do. What makes the position genuinely worth sitting with is not whether you think it is right, but what it forces you to articulate about why you think it is wrong. Most people's objection is that human life is valuable, that human experience and culture and love and creativity are things worth having in the world. But that objection requires being specific about what exactly you are defending and why it outweighs what you are dismissing. Whether you can give a compelling answer to that question, one that accounts honestly for what human civilization has produced alongside what it has destroyed, is harder than it might seem when the question arrives unexpectedly. What would you say to someone who asked you to give the best possible argument for the value of humanity's continued existence? And how confident are you that the argument would actually be good enough? There is a version of the voluntary extinction argument that is less about ecology and more about experience, and it has connections to the antinatalist arguments discussed earlier. If you accept that coming into existence involves guaranteed suffering, and if you accept that the suffering of the many species displaced or destroyed by human civilization is real and significant, then the argument for reducing human presence on Earth has both a personal and an ecological dimension. Whether the ecological argument is strong depends on empirical facts about how ecosystems function and recover, about whether human technology could eventually solve the problems human civilization created, about whether something like a sustainable human presence is actually possible or whether the current model is the only model. These are genuinely contested empirical questions, and people who know a great deal about ecology disagree about the answers. What is not contested is that the question of whether human existence is worth its ecological cost is a real question that has mostly gone unasked in mainstream ethical thinking. Most ethical frameworks take the value of human existence as a starting point, rather than as something to be argued for. Voluntary human extinction makes that assumption visible by denying it, which forces anyone who wants to argue against the position to actually articulate what they are defending and why. Most people, when pressed, can articulate reasons to value human existence, the experience of beauty, of love, of understanding, of connection, the achievements of art and science, the capacity for moral growth. Whether these outweigh the costs is a calculation that requires honesty about both sides, and the honesty about the cost side is rarer than the honesty about the value side. What would change about how you live if you took seriously the question of whether your existence justifies its costs, not as a source of guilt, but as a genuine question about how to orient yourself in a world that bears the marks of what human civilization has done to it? Knight has been promoting his position since 1991 without apparent diminishment of enthusiasm. The position is coherent, argued from premises many people find plausible, and has resisted dismissal for several decades. What does it tell you about a civilization that the argument for its voluntary ending is not obviously ridiculous, and what would it take for you to find it not just coherent, but genuinely worth considering? Thermal death of the universe. At some point, far enough in the future, that the number of years required to describe it has more digits than there are atoms in the observable universe, the last star will go out, not dramatically, not in an explosion or a cataclysm, just a slow cooling, a gradual dimming, a stellar object whose fuel finally runs out and whose light simply stops. After that, the universe will contain black holes and cold dead matter and an increasingly dilute distribution of particles in a space that keeps expanding and cooling. Eventually, the black holes will evaporate too, through a process called Hawking radiation, releasing energy so slowly that the process takes an amount of time that makes stellar lifetimes look like an instant. And when the last black hole is gone, the universe will contain nothing but an extremely dilute collection of particles, separated by distances so vast that they will never interact again, in a space so cold that no process requiring energy gradients can occur. Physicists call this state heat death, or maximum entropy, or thermodynamic equilibrium. Every form of order, every structure, every pattern that energy has ever arranged itself into will have dissolved back into uniform randomness. There will be nothing left to power any process, no gradient, no difference, no potential. Whatever life existed, whatever consciousness arose, whatever was understood or loved or made, will be gone so completely that not even the possibility of its existence will remain. Whether this matters is a question that depends heavily on what you think matters and over what timescale. Most ethical frameworks operate over human timescales, decades at the most. A universe that ends in heat death after numbers of years that exceed human comprehension is not meaningfully different, for practical purposes, from a universe that ends tomorrow. The distance between those two endpoints is so vast that all of human history is compressed into a single point at the beginning of the line. And yet people find the heat death of the universe disturbing in a way that the more immediate problems of life do not quite produce. There is something specific about the totality and the permanence of it. Not just that everything you love will end, which is true of everything. Not just that everything humanity has built will eventually be gone, which is also true, but that eventually the conditions that made any of it possible will be gone, permanently and completely, with no possibility of recurrence or recovery. Whether that permanence changes anything about how you think about the present is something people answer differently. Some find it makes the present more precious, a brief and unlikely spark in an overwhelming darkness. Others find it deflating in a way that makes the spark feel less rather than more significant. Others still find themselves essentially unable to feel anything about timescales that distant, which might be the most reasonable response. What is strange about the heat death is that it does not require any catastrophe. No asteroid, no war, no failure of civilization. Everything could go as well as possible. Every hope realized, every problem solved, every species that ever lived given the longest possible run. And still, this is where things end. The ending is not a failure. It is just what thermodynamics requires of a finite system in an expanding universe. What is the relationship between how you live today and where all of this is going? And is the answer that there is no relationship, or that knowing the destination changes something about the journey, however slightly? There is a philosophical position that takes the heat death as its central fact and builds everything else around it. Existence is not a project with a direction, order is a temporary anomaly in a universe trending toward maximum disorder. Consciousness is a brief and improbable exception in a universe overwhelmingly characterized by the absence of anything that would care about that absence. What the heat death refuses to do is offer any escape through narrative resolution. Secular philosophies that find meaning in legacy and the long arc of human progress run into the problem that the arc does not arc toward anything. It just curves into cold. Whether that is something you can sit with depends on how much you need the universe to be going somewhere, rather than just winding down. There is something almost peaceful about the heat death as an ending, if you can hold it at sufficient distance. No violence, no tragedy in the usual sense, just an extraordinarily slow return to a state of equilibrium, the universe resting after everything it has done. What would it change about how you spend your time if you genuinely kept the heat death in view? And does the answer tell you something about whether that knowledge is worth carrying or worth setting down? Cosmologists sometimes describe the heat death with a kind of professional detachment that is itself interesting to sit with. They calculate the timescales, describe the processes, explain the thermodynamics, and the emotional register of their descriptions is often closer to curiosity than dread. Whether that is because the timescales are so vast they do not feel real, or because scientists have found a way to hold the information without being destabilized by it, or because the information genuinely does not carry the weight it might seem to, is unclear. But you are not a cosmologist calculating timescales right now. You are a person lying somewhere in the dark, and the universe is still doing everything it does, and the heat death is still where this ends. What you do with both of those things at once is entirely up to you, and probably has been for longer than you realized. Cioran's Decay. Émile Cioran was a Romanian philosopher who spent most of his adult life in Paris writing in French rather than his native Romanian, and who produced some of the most beautifully written pessimistic philosophy in any language. He was not a systematic thinker in the academic sense. He wrote in aphorisms, in short passages, in moments of compressed observation that resist being turned into arguments. What he produced instead was a sustained record of one person's experience of existence, described with a precision and a dark wit that makes it genuinely hard to set down, even when you find it disturbing. His central preoccupation was decay. Not decay as a metaphor, but as a fact. Physical decay, the bodies we inhabit gradually failing. Cultural decay, the civilizations we build gradually crumbling. Philosophical decay, the ideas we hold gradually losing their purchase. For Cioran, existence was fundamentally a process of deterioration, and the interesting question was not how to stop it, but what kind of relationship to have with it while it was happening. He was not, despite appearances, advocating for suicide or for despair. He was doing something stranger and more interesting. He was trying to think clearly about what it is actually like to be alive without the consolations that most philosophical and religious frameworks provide. Without the idea that suffering is meaningful, without the idea that consciousness is a gift, without the idea that history is progressing somewhere worth going. He wanted to see clearly, and what he saw, clearly, was not particularly encouraging. What makes Cioran genuinely interesting rather than just relentlessly bleak is his sense of humor. He found the whole situation darkly funny in a way that keeps the writing from collapsing into self-pity. He once wrote that he had decided to be born in the wrong century, the wrong country, the wrong family, and on reflection, this seemed to him like exactly the right decision. He was capable of holding his own pessimism at arm's length and laughing at it, even while meaning it. His relationship to hope is particularly interesting. He did not think hope was simply an error. He thought it was a survival mechanism, something that keeps people going long enough to produce children and build things, and that its irrationality was part of what made it effective. But he could not participate in it without a kind of internal reservation, a knowledge that the hope was not quite honest. Whether you find that reservation admirable or just exhausting probably depends on your own relationship to optimism. Cioran spent much of his career being rediscovered in waves, each generation finding in him an articulation of something they had been feeling without having words for it. Whether this says something about the ideas or just about the recurring human tendency toward existential melancholy is hard to say. His books are short. Each one can be read in an evening, and they have the quality of conversation, of someone saying quietly in the dark the things that most people think and most people decide not to say. What would you say about your own existence if you were not trying to make it sound like it was going somewhere? And is there any part of you that finds the not making it sound like anything a relief? Cioran's specific contribution to the tradition of pessimist philosophy is the form as much as the content. Schopenhauer wrote systematically in long arguments. Nietzsche wrote in aphorisms too, but with enormous energy, always building towards something. Cioran wrote without building toward anything. Each passage stood alone. Each observation was complete in itself. The absence of systematic argument was not a failure of rigor, but a formal decision, an acknowledgement that the kind of understanding he was after did not come through argument, but through recognition. When you read him, what happens is not that he convinces you of anything. What happens is that he puts into words something you had been aware of without being able to articulate. And the articulation is both a relief and a slight additional weight. You knew this already. Knowing it more clearly does not help and does not hurt. It just makes it slightly more present than it was. Cioran thought the desire to arrive at actionable conclusions was itself a symptom of the thing he was trying to examine, the refusal to sit with what is without demanding that it be something you can use. What Cioran does, at his best, is make you feel less alone in the specific texture of your own experience. Not by offering solutions, but by demonstrating that someone else went to the same place and came back with a sentence that fits. His final years brought advancing dementia, which he had written about with some prescience, describing the mind returning to a state before thought, before the particular burden of consciousness his entire career had examined. Whether he found that a relief or a horror, by the end he was no longer able to say. What is the thought about your own existence that you have had most often but found hardest to say out loud? And what would change about how you carried it if someone had already said it for you? Cioran would probably say the carrying changes less than you hope and more than you fear. Existential Void. Most of the philosophies in this series have precise intellectual histories, specific thinkers who formulated them, arguments that can be examined and contested. The existential void is different. It is less a philosophical position than a description of an experience that many people have and that philosophy has spent a great deal of time trying to either explain or explain away. The experience goes something like this. You are in the middle of your ordinary life, doing ordinary things, when a question surfaces that does not have the character of an ordinary question. Not what should I do next, or what do I believe about some specific issue. Something more like, why any of this? Why existence rather than nothing? Why this particular form that existence has taken? Why you? Why now? Why at all? And the question is not accompanied by a possible answer. It is accompanied by a kind of opening in the usual sense of things, a gap where the meaning should be. Philosophers have called this various things. Heidegger talked about anxiety as the mood in which beings are revealed as contingent, as not necessary, as things that happen to be rather than things that had to be. Sartre talked about nausea, the experience of existence as gratuitous, as without justification, as just there. Camus talked about the absurd. All of these are attempts to name something that most people have experienced in some form, if only briefly. What distinguishes the existential void from ordinary unhappiness or depression is its specific quality. You are not suffering because something is wrong. You are suffering, or at least unsettled, because nothing is wrong in the way that being wrong would require something to be wrong. Ordinary unhappiness has an object. You are unhappy about something specific. The existential void is not about anything specific. It is about the structure of things rather than any particular thing within the structure. Whether this experience is a genuine insight into the nature of reality or a symptom of a particular kind of mind encountering its own limits is contested. Philosophers in the existentialist tradition tend to treat it as insight. Psychologists and neuroscientists tend to treat it as a cognitive state that can be influenced by sleep, exercise, nutrition, social connection, and other factors that have nothing to do with the ultimate nature of reality. Both things can be simultaneously true. What is interesting about the existential void as an experience is how universal it seems to be across cultures and time periods. Descriptions of something like it appear in religious texts, in ancient philosophy, in poetry and literature, from traditions that had no contact with each other. Whether that universality is evidence that the experience is tracking something real about the structure of existence, or just that it is a natural consequence of having the kind of consciousness humans have, is something nobody has resolved. Most people who experience it find it passes. The ordinary texture of life reasserts itself. The gap closes, not because it has been answered, but because the conditions that opened it have shifted. Whether closing is resolution or just deferral is a question each person seems to answer differently. What was the last time you felt the particular quality of that opening? And what closed it? And whether the closing was something you chose or something that simply happened is worth paying attention to. When the void surfaces, people tend to respond in one of a few ways. Some close it through distraction, filling the gap with activity until the ordinary texture reasserts itself. Some try to think their way through it, attempting to construct an answer to the why question. Some sit with it, neither closing it nor forcing it, until it shifts on its own. None of these responses is obviously correct. Distraction works in the sense that the void closes, but if it was tracking something real, distraction just defers the tracking. Thinking your way through it has produced some of the most important philosophy in the Western tradition, and also, probably, some of the most elaborate consoling nonsense. Heidegger thought anxiety in the philosophical sense was not something to eliminate. He thought it was one of the few moods that disclosed the actual structure of existence, rather than concealing it under layers of routine. On his reading, the existential void is not a malfunction. It is a moment of clarity. Most people close the gap before finding out what it might have to say. Whether that is wisdom or avoidance is something only you can answer from inside your own experience of it. What the existential void asks, if you take it seriously, is honesty about what you do not know and cannot know, about why you are here and what will have been true about your being here after you are no longer here. These are questions without available answers, and the void is the experience of encountering that unavailability directly. Contemplative traditions have developed practices for staying in the void rather than closing it. Meditation, prayer, certain forms of philosophical inquiry all treat the experience not as a problem to solve, but as a territory to inhabit. Whether those practices produce anything other than a higher tolerance for uncomfortable openness is something each person has to find out. What was the last time you felt the particular quality of that opening? And what closed it? And whether the closing was something you chose or something that simply happened is worth paying attention to. Absurdism. We started this series with Eternal Recurrence, with the thought of your life repeating forever, and what that would demand of you. We end with Absurdism, which is in some ways the position that makes the most sense of everything in between. Not a resolution to any of it, something more like a stance you can take toward everything in between, and a description of what it looks like to keep living clearly with none of it resolved. Albert Camus distinguished absurdism from nihilism carefully. Nihilism says nothing matters cosmically, and concludes that we must create meaning anyway, not because we have resolved the contradiction, but because we are the kind of things that need meaning and live inside a universe that does not provide it. The contradiction is permanent. The response to the contradiction is what we are. He used the image of Sisyphus, condemned by the gods to push a boulder up a hill for eternity, watching it roll back every time he reached the top. Camus argued that Sisyphus should be imagined as happy, not because the task is not pointless, because Sisyphus owns the task. He does not pretend it means something it does not. He pushes the boulder anyway, fully and without reservation, and in that fulliness there is something that resembles dignity even in the complete absence of cosmic meaning. Whether this is satisfying depends on what you need from philosophy. If you need resolution, absurdism will frustrate you because it refuses resolution. It holds the contradiction open deliberately. If you need permission to keep going without a guarantee that going is justified, absurdism might be exactly the right framework. What distinguishes absurdism from simple despair is the quality of the engagement. Despair closes things down. The absurdist response keeps things open, keeps engaging, keeps creating and connecting and building, knowing full well that none of it will ultimately amount to anything at the scale of the cosmos, and doing it anyway with something like joy. Not in spite of the absurd, but within it, shaped by it, honest about it. Camus thought the absurdist was the person who had stopped pretending, who had looked at the universe, seen what it actually was, and decided that pretending it was something else, something that supported them, or cared about them, or was moving towards something worth moving toward, was a kind of dishonesty he could not maintain. Better to see clearly and live fully than to live comfortably inside a consoling fiction. Whether he was right, whether the clear-eyed absurdist life is actually available to ordinary people, or whether it requires a specific temperament and a specific set of life circumstances, is something the philosophy does not quite settle. Camus himself had enormous charm, enormous creative gifts, a rich social life, and died young in a car accident at 46. How much of his absurdism was philosophy, and how much was personality is impossible to separate. But the question he was asking is real, regardless of who was asking it. How do you keep going when you have honestly faced the fact that there is no external guarantee that going is worth it? And what does the keeping going actually look like, from the inside, when the pretending has stopped? That question started this series, and it ends here too, still open, still without an answer that settles it, which is probably where the most honest questions live. There is a version of absurdism that is not philosophical at all, but just describes how most people actually live without having a name for it. Most people, when they look honestly at their lives, do not have a satisfying answer to why any of this matters in any ultimate sense. They keep going anyway. They keep caring about the people around them, keep working on the things they are working on, keep finding Tuesday afternoons either pleasant or unpleasant in ways that feel real and significant, even though they know, if pressed, that the significance does not have a cosmic backing. That is absurdism in practice. Not the grand philosophical version, but the ordinary, untheorized version that most people live without anyone having pointed out what it is. What Camus did was give that ordinary condition a name and an argument and a posture toward it. He said, "You are already doing this. Here is what it would mean to do it consciously, with both eyes open, without pretending the contradiction is resolved." And that shift from unconscious absurdism to conscious absurdism is the difference he thought mattered. Whether it actually matters, whether the conscious version is better or just different or in some ways harder, is something you can only find out by trying it. And trying it means continuing to do what you are already doing while being more honest about the conditions under which you are doing it. Absurdism is the only position here that does not try to tell you the worst thing about existence. It tries to tell you what you can do with the worst things, which is not the same. Cioran described, Schopenhauer explained, Benatar argued. Camus suggested a way to stand and left the standing to you. Whether that is enough depends on whether you need a conclusion or can live in the open question.